What's up everyone? You're here at The Fiction Wizard. We're dropping something epic today. A Muggle Headteacher reported Harry's bruises to social services. By Monday the Wizarding World knew too. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 1. What Mrs. Albright saw. The summer literacy program met every Tuesday and Thursday in the back hall of Little Whinging Community Center, which smelled permanently of instant coffee and the ghost of someone's packed lunch. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. Folding tables had been arranged into rough clusters, each one holding a box of pencils, a stack of worn paperbacks, and a laminated sheet of that week's vocabulary words. The words this week were persevere, deduce, consequence, and ambition. Mrs. Diane Albright had chosen them herself. She had been a headteacher for 19 years. Before that, a deputy head. Before that, a Year 6 classroom teacher who had once confiscated 17 Tamagotchis in a single afternoon and felt entirely justified. She was 61, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the particular quality common to experienced educators, the ability to appear to be looking at one thing while actually watching something else entirely. Right now she appeared to be reviewing attendance sheets. She was actually watching the boy at table 3. He'd come in with the Polkiss child, small, ferret-faced, a bit sly around the eyes, and 2 others whose names she hadn't learned yet. They'd been loud coming through the door, shoving each other, doing what boys did. But this one, the thin one with the glasses and the dark hair that went in every direction like it had somewhere to be, had gone quiet the moment the door closed behind him. He'd peeled away from the group so naturally that none of them seemed to notice. He'd found himself a seat at the edge of table 3, pulled the nearest book towards him, and begun to read. Not pretending to read. Actually reading. His eyes moved, and occasionally his mouth twitched. That was the first thing she'd noticed. The second thing she noticed was how he sat. There was a particular way some children held themselves, a kind of permanent physical apology, shoulders drawn in, elbows tucked, taking up as little space as possible, even in an empty room. It wasn't shyness, exactly. Mrs. Albright had seen plenty of shy children. Shy children still expanded when no one was looking. This boy stayed compressed regardless. The third thing she noticed, when she came around the tables to check in with the students midway through the session, was his forearm. She'd asked him what he was reading, Danny the Champion of the World, Roald Dahl, battered copy with a cracked spine, and he'd looked up at her with green eyes that were startlingly direct for a child who clearly wanted to be invisible. When he'd turned the book to show her the cover, his sleeve had shifted. She'd kept her face neutral. 19 years. There were 3 separate bruises on his forearm in varying stages of yellowing. One was oblong, with a shape that she recognized, in the way that experienced teachers recognize things they wished they didn't, the shape of a grip. Fingers. Someone had grabbed this child hard enough to bruise, recently enough that it hadn't fully faded. Good choice, she said, nodding at the book. Have you read it before? Twice, he said, and there was something almost sheepish in the way he said it, not embarrassed to have read it twice, but uncertain whether that was the right answer to give her. Like he'd learned to check other people's expressions before deciding how to feel about his own responses. What's your favorite part so far? He considered this with genuine seriousness. Most children his age would have said I don't know and looked at the table. This one actually thought about it. The pheasants, he said finally. The bit where Danny works it out on his own. Nobody tells him how. He just figures it. I like that bit too, she said. She moved on to the next table. She did not look back at him, because looking back would have made him look back, and she'd already seen what she needed to see. His name, according to the sign-in sheet, was Harry Potter. Age 10. Address, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Mrs. Albright had been running the summer program for 6 years, and she'd had students from Privet Drive before. It was that kind of street, neat, conventional, the sort of place where the bins were always out at exactly the right time and the hedges competed in an unspoken war for perpendicularity. The families there were not, in her experience, the kind who sent their children to free literacy programs. They sent their children to tennis camps, or they paid for tutors who came to the house. The fact that this boy was here at all was mildly interesting. The Bruises were not mildly interesting. At the end of the session, she stood at the door and said goodbye to each child as they filed out. She'd learned this from her first mentor teacher, 30 years ago: stand at the door, see their faces as they leave, catch the ones who aren't sure they want to go. When Harry Potter reached her, she smiled at him. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Yeah," he said. Then, after a moment, "Is that okay? Coming back?" "Of course," she said. "We're glad you're here." Something moved through his expression, quick as a fish in dark water. Then he nodded and walked out into the car park where the Polkiss boy and the others were waiting, and Mrs. Albright stood in the doorway and watched until they turned the corner, and then she went back inside and sat down at her desk and wrote 3 pages of careful, precise notes. He came back Thursday. He came alone this time, which told her something. He had a small rucksack over one shoulder, the strap frayed where it attached to the bag, repaired once with what looked like electrical tape. His trainers were a size too large. His jeans were too long and had been rolled up at the ankle. Everything he was wearing was functional and nothing fit, in the way that suggested it hadn't been bought for him. This was not, in itself, evidence of anything. Some families were struggling. Some children inherited older siblings' clothes. Mrs. Albright was careful with herself about the difference between concerning and conclusive. But she watched him more closely today. She had arranged the session slightly differently, a group writing activity, which meant the children had to sit together and collaborate on a short story. This meant talking, movement, shifting around. It meant she could see more. Harry was at table 2 today, with a girl called Yasmin who went to St. Gregory's Primary and talked constantly, and a quiet boy called Marcus whose mother sat in the car park and read a novel while she waited. Harry listened to Yasmin without interrupting her, which was itself an achievement. He offered suggestions in a way that made them sound like questions, which meant Yasmin adopted them without feeling corrected, which meant the story progressed. He was doing the social mathematics of not being too visible, not being too useful, not standing out in any direction. 10 years old. Around 11:15, Marcus accidentally knocked his water bottle off the table. It hit the floor with a bang, not loud, not particularly, but Harry flinched as though a shot had been fired. His whole body jerked sideways, shoulders up, one arm raised slightly. It lasted less than a second. Then he looked at the bottle on the floor and his face went carefully blank and he bent down and picked it up and handed it to Marcus without a word. Marcus said thanks. Yasmin kept talking. Neither of them had noticed. Mrs. Albright excused herself from table 4, where she'd been, and went to refill the pencil cup at the supply table, which was positioned near table 2. She didn't approach. She just stood close enough, for long enough, to see the bruising that was visible at the collar of his t-shirt when he leaned forward to write. His neck. The right side. She refilled the pencil cup and went back to table 4 and asked Carla how her story was going, and Carla said fine, and Mrs. Albright said good. She was very good at her face. The session ended at 12:30. The children filed out. Harry was near the back of the group, unhurried, which meant he was last through the door, which meant she caught him alone. "Harry." She said it easily, like it was nothing. "Have you got a minute?" He stopped. His expression did something complicated, not fear, precisely, but a kind of heightened attention, like an animal that's heard something it's still deciding whether to run from. "Yeah," he said. She gestured to the nearest chair. She sat down in the one across from him, which put them at the same level, and she kept her posture loose and open. Everything she'd learned from 20 years of talking to children who didn't want to talk. "Are you enjoying the program?" she asked. He visibly recalibrated, he'd been expecting something else. "Yeah," he said. "I like the books. You're a good reader. Have you always read a lot?" "When I can," he said, which was an interesting way to put it. "When you can," she repeated, gently. "Do you not have much time, usually?" A small shrug. "I have chores." "What kind of chores?" He looked at her with those direct green eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was assessing her, working out how much honesty was safe. "Cooking, mostly," he said finally. "And the garden. And cleaning. That's quite a lot for someone your age." Another shrug. "It's fine." She let a moment of quiet sit between them. One of the fluorescent tubes was flickering slightly, and somewhere outside, someone was mowing a lawn. She took her glasses off and set them on the table, which was something she did deliberately. It made her look slightly less formal, slightly less like someone filling out a form. "Harry, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know it's all right to tell me the truth." "All right?" His chin came up, just slightly. "All right. Have you hurt yourself recently?" "Your arms and neck, I noticed some bruises." The silence that followed was not the silence of a child working out how to lie. It was the silence of a child working out how much truth was survivable. "I fall," he said. "I'm clumsy." It was delivered flatly, with the cadence of something rehearsed many times. It wasn't even a lie he'd constructed for her, it was a lie that had been constructed for him, probably years ago, that he'd just been walking around in. "I fall too," she said, pleasantly. "I've never bruised my neck that way." He looked at the table. "Your aunt and uncle, they look after you?" "Yeah." "Are they good at it?" The pause before he said yes was 3 seconds long. She counted. "Yeah," he said. "It's fine." Fine. He used that word a lot. She suspected it was doing a great deal of heavy lifting in his life. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for talking to me." She stood, and picked up her glasses, and put them back on. "Will you come back Tuesday?" He looked at her, still trying to read her. "You're not going to ring my uncle?" "Not right now," she said, which was truthful. He nodded and picked up his bag and left, and Mrs. Albright sat back down and put her hands flat on the table and breathed for a moment before she picked up her phone. She did not ring his uncle. She rang her former colleague Patricia, who had left teaching 3 years ago to work for the local authorities' child protection team, and she described what she'd seen over 2 sessions in the careful, precise language that Patricia immediately understood. "You're sure about the grip bruise?" Patricia said. "I've seen grip bruises," Mrs. Albright said. 19 years. Age and address? 10. 4 Privet Drive. I'll flag it today. Can you write up your observations formally and email them to me? I'm doing it now, she said. Patricia, he said fine like he doesn't know any other word. A pause. I know, Patricia said. Write it up. I'll push it through. Mrs. Albright typed up her notes with the windows open, a July breeze moving through the room, the sound of the lawnmower fading. She was methodical. She included dates, times, the specific location and coloring of each bruise, the flinch response, the phrasing of his answers, the 3-second pause. She used precise language. She made no accusations. She simply described what she had seen, because what she had seen was enough. She sent the email at 2:14 on a Thursday afternoon, and then she made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and she thought about a 10-year-old boy who said fine like it was armor, and who could tell her his favorite part of any book but couldn't take up space in an empty room. The formal report was filed with Surrey Social Services that same afternoon. It was routed, as these things were, to the duty team covering Little Whinging, and from the duty team it was assigned to a caseworker for initial review. The caseworker who received it was a woman named Elaine Marsh. Elaine Marsh was 34 years old. She had pale reddish hair, a pragmatic manner, and a desk that was buried under a permanent stratum of case files, training materials, and empty biscuit packets. She was good at her job in the way that people who have made it their whole personality are good at their jobs, thorough, protective of the children in her caseload, occasionally infuriating to her managers because she refused to close cases until she was satisfied. She had also, at the age of 17, received a letter from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry that she'd never been able to attend, because magic required a specific interior quality that she possessed in roughly the same way a person might possess a single musical note, just enough to detect, not enough to use. She had been assessed as a squib. Her parents, a pair of Muggle-born witches who'd retired to Guildford, had held her while she cried about it and then quietly, over the years, helped her build connections to both worlds she half belonged to. She had a contact in the ministry. Technically everyone in her position was supposed to have one, under a quiet protocol established in the mid-80s that almost nobody ever needed and almost nobody remembered. The protocol existed because magical children occasionally surfaced in Muggle welfare systems, a child raised by a magical family who'd been accidentally exposed, a half-blood left with Muggle relatives, a squib who didn't understand why they were different. In those cases, the Muggle social worker was supposed to flag the case to their ministry liaison, and the two systems were supposed to coordinate. Elaine had used the protocol exactly once before, for a 7-year-old with accidental magic incidents that had been terrifying his foster carers. That had been handled quickly and quietly. She looked at the file in front of her. She looked at the address. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. She looked at the child's name. Harry Potter. She was still for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and found the thin, dog-eared ministry directory that looked, to any Muggle who might have accidentally picked it up, like a small-print telecommunications guide. She found the direct contact number for her liaison, a clerk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement named Henderson, who she'd spoken to twice in 5 years. She didn't ring Henderson. She looked at the file again. Mrs. Albright's notes were meticulous. The grip bruise. The flinch response. The boy saying fine with the cadence of a rehearsed answer. Cooking and gardening and cleaning. A 10-year-old. Harry Potter. Elaine Marsh had been born in 1961. She had been 17 in 1978, which meant she'd grown up entirely within the wizarding world's peripheral awareness, which meant she knew things, overheard things, things her mother said at the dinner table, things her father referenced with the careful vagueness of people keeping secrets from children. She knew the name Harry Potter the way everyone in both worlds knew it, like a weather event, like a historical fact, like something that had happened to everyone at once. She also knew, if she thought about it, and she was thinking about it now, sitting at her desk on a Thursday afternoon with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, that Harry Potter, the boy who had survived, the boy the whole wizarding world had apparently celebrated and then immediately forgotten about, had been left with his mother's sister in Little Whinging, Surrey. And that nobody, in all the years since, had apparently driven out to Little Whinging, Surrey to ask the child whether he was fine. She picked up the ministry directory. She put it down again. She read Mrs. Albright's notes once more, all the way through, and then she wrote her own initial assessment at the bottom of the form, flagged the case as priority, and picked up the directory for the second time. This time she kept it in her hand. She didn't ring Henderson. Henderson was a clerk. Henderson would route it through channels, and channels had a way of routing things very slowly in the direction of whoever had the most seniority and the most invested in the way things currently were. She flipped to the back of the directory, where a second list of contacts was printed in slightly smaller type. This list was labeled, in ministry terminology, specialist consultation, unusual circumstances. Most of the names were for things like cursebreaker consultation or accidental magic reversal response. But at the very bottom, added in handwriting rather than print, the handwriting of whoever had maintained this directory before it had been passed to Elaine, was a name and a contact address. Arabella Figg, Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging. Retired. Former observation. Elaine Marsh looked at this for a long time. Then she looked up Arabella Figg in the Muggle telephone directory, which sat on the shelf above her desk, and found a listing for a Figg on Wisteria Walk. She wrote the number on a post-it note and stuck it to the corner of her computer screen, and she sat back in her chair, and she thought about a 10-year-old boy who had apparently spent his whole life being told he was fine by people who knew he wasn't. She thought about the wizarding world, the world she was half part of and half excluded from, the world that had celebrated this boy's survival and then filed him away like a solved problem. She thought about Mrs. Albright, who ran a free literacy program out of a community center in a Surrey suburb and had noticed, in 2 sessions, what apparently none of the wizards who were supposedly watching over this child had seen fit to do anything about. Elaine Marsh was not a particularly angry person by nature. She was pragmatic. She believed in process. But she was angry now, in a cold and focused way that made her very, very good at her job. She wrote up a full priority case assessment, submitted it formally to the duty manager with a recommendation for an urgent welfare check, and then, after 5 o'clock, when the office was quiet, she rang the number on the post-it note. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered. Her voice had the slightly performative querulousness of someone who was much more alert than they were letting on. "Hello? Mrs. Figg," said Elaine Marsh. "My name is Elaine Marsh. I'm calling about a child in your neighborhood. I think you might be expecting a call like this." A very short pause. "I've been expecting this call," said Arabella Figg, "for approximately 9 years." Elaine drove past 4 Privet Drive at 7:30 on Friday evening, which wasn't a proper visit. She hadn't scheduled one yet, and showing up without notice on a first contact was sometimes useful, sometimes counterproductive, and she wanted to see the house first. She wanted to build a picture. It was exactly the sort of street she'd expected from the address. Identical houses. Identical gardens. The peculiar aggressive tidiness of a community that has decided cleanliness is a form of character. She drove slowly past number 4 and saw a large car on the drive, a very neat front lawn, curtains that were slightly too good for the window frames, a garden ornament near the door that was just one ornament short of being tacky. The house told her, comfortable. Conventional. Invested in appearances. She had been in houses like this before, for other children. The ones that looked like this from the outside were sometimes the hardest, because the people inside had built very convincing alternative narratives, and they believed them completely. She didn't stop. She drove to the end of the street, turned around, and went home. On Saturday morning she wrote her contact report from the phone conversation with Arabella Figg, which she filed under specialist consultation and kept very carefully worded. Arabella had told her nothing she could put directly in a Muggle case file. But she had confirmed, in the careful, oblique language of someone who had been waiting a long time to confirm it, that Harry Potter had been living at number 4 with his aunt, uncle, and cousin since he was 15 months old. That he was often sent to her house as a form of minding rather than any genuine care. That the cousin was well-fed and well-dressed and Harry was neither. That she had raised concerns, in the past, with the people responsible for overseeing the arrangement, and that these concerns had been noted. Noted. They noted them, Arabella had said, with a particular flatness, and they carried on. Elaine had written all of this down in a notebook that she kept in her personal bag, in shorthand, and she had then sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what she was actually dealing with. What she was dealing with was a child who had been placed, by people with the power to arrange things, with relatives who were hurting him. And she was dealing with the possibility that those same people knew more than they'd said and had decided, for reasons she couldn't fully access from her position, that this was acceptable. It was not acceptable. Elaine Marsh had a specific and non-negotiable view on what her job was, which was, children did not get hurt on her watch if she could help it. She was not interested in the reasons adults gave for why a particular arrangement was necessary. She had heard necessary before. She had learned that necessary, in her line of work, usually meant convenient for the adults. She rang her duty manager on Saturday morning and escalated the case to the weekend emergency team. She cited the priority assessment, cited Mrs. Albright's written submission, and said she wanted a welfare check and formal interview conducted by Tuesday at the latest. The duty manager said he'd try for Wednesday. Elaine said Tuesday. The duty manager knew her tone and said Tuesday. She then opened her personal notebook and looked at the name she'd written at the bottom of the page, with a question mark next to it. She'd need to make a second call. Not to Henderson. Not to Arabella Figg, who was a watcher with no power to act. To whoever was actually responsible. She found the name in the back of her ministry directory, in the Legal and Guardianship Matters section, which listed the standard contact for any wizarding guardianship arrangements that intersected with Muggle civil records. The section had a general contact number and a note, for matters of significant concern, escalate directly to the head of magical law enforcement. Head of Magical Law Enforcement, Madame Amelia Bones. That was a name Elaine knew. Everyone in both worlds knew that name, in the same way they knew the word rigorous and associated it instinctively with a person who used it properly. She wrote Amelia Bones's name at the top of a fresh page in her notebook and drew a circle around it. Below the name she wrote, Harry Potter, 10, 4 Privet Drive. Priority welfare. Muggle social services involved. Escalation required. Below that she wrote, someone needs to answer for this. She underlined it. Twice. Outside her kitchen window, Surrey was having a perfectly ordinary Saturday. Children cycled past. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The sky was the specific shade of pale English blue that showed up mostly in July and suggested it wasn't really trying. Elaine Marsh closed her notebook, finished her tea, and began drafting the memo that would, by Sunday evening, be making its way through Ministry internal post, hand-delivered, sealed, and marked urgent and confidential, to the desk of Madame Amelia Bones, head of Magical Law Enforcement. The memo would reach her at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, while Amelia Bones was still at her desk, as she usually was. She would read it twice. She would place it face down on her desk and put both hands flat on top of it and sit there for a moment. Then she would pick up her quill and begin writing 3 separate letters, one to the Hogwarts headmaster, one to Minerva McGonagall personally, and one to herself, in the form of a set of notes she would carry into a meeting she was already planning. But that was Sunday. On this particular Friday, on Privet Drive, the curtains at number 4 were drawn, and behind them Harry Potter was sitting on the floor of the smallest bedroom with his back against the bed frame, reading Danny the Champion of the World by the light of a torch he'd found in the kitchen drawer and kept, because nobody had noticed it missing. He'd read it before. He was reading it again. He'd got to the bit where Danny works it out on his own. Nobody tells him how. He just figures it. Harry read that part 3 times, the way he always did, and the torch made a small warm circle on the page, and outside the locked door his uncle's television muttered and laughed, and the evening moved along in the way evenings did, and Harry Potter did not know that a woman he'd never met had sat in a community center that afternoon and written 3 pages of careful notes about him. He didn't know that another woman was at her kitchen table writing his name in a circle. He didn't know that anyone was coming. He knew the book. He knew the trick about the pheasants, the part where everything clicks because one person decided to think instead of wait. He liked that part best because it felt true, even though it was fiction, the idea that if you thought hard enough and long enough about a problem, you could find the part of it that was solvable. He clicked the torch off to save the battery and lay down on his side on the thin mattress and looked at the slat of orange street light coming under the door, and somewhere in number 4 a door slammed, and he didn't flinch this time because he'd heard it often enough to know the exact weight of it. He'd figure it out, he thought. Whatever it was. He always did. He turned over and closed his eyes, and the night settled around 4 Privet Drive like a hand pressing down, and the street stayed quiet, and the report that Mrs. Albright had filed at 2:14 on a Thursday afternoon sat in a digital case file in a local authority server in Surrey, with the word priority stamped in red at the top, and began to move. Chapter 2, the memo that arrived before breakfast. The owl arrived at Minerva McGonagall's cottage at 5:47 on Monday morning. She was already awake. She was almost always already awake at 5:47. She had a strict relationship with sleep. She gave it the hours between 11 and 5, and after that she considered the arrangement concluded. By the time the owl tapped at the kitchen window she was on her second cup of tea, dressed, with a stack of third-year essays on the table in front of her that she'd been meaning to mark since June and kept finding reasons not to. She opened the window. The owl dropped the letter and left without waiting for a response, which told her something about the sender's urgency before she'd even broken the seal. The seal was the ministry crest. The handwriting on the front was Amelia Bones's. She recognized it because Amelia Bones had a handwriting that looked like it was dictating terms rather than writing a name. Square, precise, entirely without flourish. Minerva opened it. She read it once quickly, the way she read everything once quickly. Then she put it down on the table, flat, and looked at it. Then she read it again. The second reading was slower, and by the end of it her teacup was cold and the essays were still unmarked and the morning was coming up blue and clear through the kitchen window and she was sitting very still with both hands in her lap. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was procedural, Madam Bones introducing the situation, the Muggle welfare report, the priority classification, the social worker, the involvement of the Muggle system. Clinical. Factual. The second paragraph was less clinical. It described, in language that remained precise but had something running beneath it like a current under ice, the specific contents of Mrs. Albright's observation notes. The grip bruise. The flinch response. The vocabulary of a 10-year-old boy who said fine the way someone said don't, as a shield rather than an answer. The third paragraph was 2 sentences. I am convening a formal inquiry, date to be confirmed. I believe you will want to be present, and I believe you will want to speak with Albus Dumbledore before you are. Minerva picked up the letter and stood up. She didn't put on her cloak. She went directly to the fireplace in the sitting room, threw in a handful of flu powder, and said, Hogwarts, headmaster's office, with the particular precision of a woman who is controlling something very carefully. The fire went green and she stepped through. Dumbledore was awake, which did not surprise her. He was behind his desk, and there was something in the arrangement of him, the slight stillness, the hands folded too deliberately, the half-moon glasses sitting on top of a letter rather than on his face, that told her he had already received his own copy. He looked up when she stepped out of the fireplace. His expression was the one she'd seen him use in difficult situations, the one that arranged his features into something attentive and open and warm, which was usually genuine but which today had a quality of effort about it, like a door being carefully held shut. Minerva, he said. You've read it, she said. I have. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was a thing she'd started doing about 15 years ago and he'd never commented on. She looked at him. He looked at her. The portraits of former headmasters pretended to sleep with varying degrees of conviction. How long, she said. Minerva, how long have you known about the conditions at Privet Drive? His pause was the wrong length. Too short to be genuine uncertainty, too long to be nothing. I have received periodic reports from, how long, she said again, quietly. Dumbledore took his glasses from under the letter and put them on. She'd noticed he did that sometimes, put them on when he needed to look at something carefully, or when he wanted a moment to think. She'd stopped finding it charming. Arabella has kept watch, he said. I have been aware that Harry's home life was, not without difficulty. Not without difficulty, she repeated. Minerva, I know what do you? She was still quiet. That was the most dangerous sign, and he knew it. Dumbledore had known her long enough to know that volume was not what you listened for with Minerva McGonagall. You listened for the temperature dropping. Because I want to be quite clear about what I think, Albus, so there is no possibility of misunderstanding between us. He waited. I think you knew that boy was being hurt, and you decided that whatever protection the blood magic offers was worth it. She held up one hand before he could speak. I am not saying you don't believe that. I am not saying you arrived at that conclusion easily or without cost to yourself. I think you thought about it a great deal, and I think you decided you were right, and I think you went to bed and slept and got up the next morning and carried on. She put her hand down. And I think that was wrong. I think it was wrong in 1981 and I think it is wrong now, and I think you know I'm right. The office was very quiet. Fawkes was on his perch, head tucked under one wing. The castle was not yet fully awake around them. Dumbledore said, "The protection that Lily's sacrifice provides, keeps him safe from Voldemort," she said, and she didn't drop her voice at the name and she watched him register that, and does absolutely nothing about a man with a bad temper and a grip like a vice. He stopped. Where does one end and the other begin, Albus, she said. You put him there to keep him safe. I understand the logic. I have understood it for 9 years. What I cannot understand, what I could not explain to you if you asked me to, is how safe became synonymous with fine. How you convinced yourself that because he was alive and undetected, he was all right. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird began to sing in the grounds, a single high note that went on and on. I told myself, he said finally, that many children have difficult home lives. That, don't. Her voice came out flat. Please don't tell me what you told yourself. I don't want to hear the argument that made it bearable. I want to hear what you're going to do. He looked at her then, properly, not the arranged expression, not the warmth as policy, but actually looked at her. She'd seen that look before. It was the look he had when he was done arguing, not because he'd been beaten but because he'd arrived somewhere honest. I'm going to cooperate fully with Madame Bones's inquiry, he said. Yes, she said. You are. And I'm going to see Harry. Not yet, she said. Amelia will have thoughts about the sequencing. And frankly, Albus, right now, the last thing that child needs is someone arriving on his doorstep to tell him the situation is being handled. He needs it to actually be handled first. Dumbledore nodded slowly. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than a single night, and she found she had no particular sympathy for it. Minerva, he said. I want you to know, I know, she said. I know you love him. That's what makes it so hard to forgive. She stood up. I'm going back to my cottage. I'll expect to hear from Amelia by this afternoon. I trust you'll make yourself available. She went to the fireplace. Minerva. She looked back. Dumbledore had his hands flat on his desk, and he was looking at them. When I left him on that doorstep, he said, you told me it was the wrong thing to do. I did, she said. You were right. The words landed simply, with no performance around them. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I was right then too, and it didn't help him. She stepped into the fire and went home. The memo that Elaine Marsh had sent on Sunday night had not, in fact, gone only to Amelia Bones. This was not because Elaine had sent it to multiple people. It was because Amelia Bones, upon reading it on Sunday evening, had immediately sent copies to 3 people, Dumbledore, McGonagall, and, through a channel that bypassed the headmaster entirely, which was a deliberate choice on her part, to Arthur Weasley at the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, with a note attached that said simply, Arthur, I understand you know this family. Read this. Then ring me. Arthur Weasley found the memo on his desk when he arrived at work on Monday morning. He arrived at 7:15 because he always arrived at 7:15, because the office was quietest then and he liked the first hour before anyone else came in, when he could drink his tea and read the Prophet and occasionally take apart a Muggle appliance that had been confiscated, just to understand how it worked. He found the memo. He read it. He read it again. Then he sat down heavily in his chair, and the chair made a sound it usually didn't, and Arthur put the memo on the desk and put his face in his hands. He had been to Privet Drive. He had driven past it in the Ford Anglia, illegally, enchanted, which was technically his own department's jurisdiction, which gave the memory a particular quality of absurdity, and he had seen the house, and he had met Harry's aunt and uncle at King's Cross, and he had thought, he could not pretend he hadn't thought it, something is not right here. He had thought it. He had thought it, and he had looked at his family, his full and loud and wonderful family, and he had thought about Harry getting on the train every year looking slightly too thin and wearing clothes that were slightly too large, and he had thought something is not right, and then, he had told himself it wasn't his business. He had told himself it wasn't his place. He had thought, surely Dumbledore knows. Surely it's being managed. Surely someone is watching. He put his hands down and looked at the ceiling of his office, which had a small damp patch shaped roughly like Scotland. There was a difference, he understood now, sitting at his desk at 7:15 on a Monday morning with the memo in front of him, between surely someone is watching and I should watch. He had outsourced the concern. He had filed it away under someone else's responsibility and gone home to Molly and the children and the noise and warmth of the borough, and Harry had gone back to Privet Drive, and Arthur had told himself it was fine. He picked up the memo and read the section about the bruises for the third time. The shape of a grip. Fingers. Someone had grabbed this child hard enough to bruise. He folded the memo very carefully and put it in his jacket pocket and picked up his quill and began writing a response to Amelia Bones that was professional and coherent and said all the right things, and only a person who knew him well would have noticed that his hand was not entirely steady. Molly didn't know yet. He needed to tell Molly. He was already, somewhere in the back of his mind, calculating the timing and the phrasing, because Molly was not, when it came to children, when it came to harm done to children, a person who took bad news calmly. She was a person who took bad news like a force of nature took it, fully, completely, without reservation. He would tell her tonight, he decided. He would tell her everything. He would include the part about himself, the I thought someone was watching part, the part where he'd known and done nothing, because he was not, when it came down to it, a man who could look his wife in the eye and give her a version of events with the inconvenient bits removed. He was already slightly frightened of how that conversation was going to go. He deserved to be. Amelia Bones had an office in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that was known, informally, as the Corner. It was not a corner office in the prestigious sense. It was simply that it occupied a corner of the department's floor space, and that the corner in question had, over the years, acquired a quality of atmosphere entirely attributable to the person who worked there. People who worked in other parts of the department said they could feel the corner from 20 feet away. They meant it as a compliment. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and a monocle she wore when reading, which gave her the air of someone who had decided details were worth examining properly. She had been head of magical law enforcement for 6 years. Before that she had been in magical law enforcement for 23 years, in various capacities. She had prosecuted Death Eater trials. She had dismantled 3 separate bribery networks operating within the ministry. She had once interviewed a witness for 11 hours, taking breaks only for water, until the witness finally said the true thing they'd been avoiding since hour 1. She was not cruel. She was simply extremely patient and extremely good at her job, and in her experience those two things together were more useful than most people understood. She had the Harry Potter file open on her desk when her assistant showed Elaine Marsh in at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Elaine looked around the office once, briefly, with the assessing glance of someone who read environments professionally. Then she sat down across from Amelia Bones and put her own case folder on her lap and met the other woman's eyes. "Thank you for coming in on short notice," Amelia said. "Thank you for responding so quickly," Elaine said. "I wasn't sure how the escalation protocol would be received." "As it should be," Amelia said. "Which is why I'm surprised it hasn't been used before." She said this with a careful neutrality, and Elaine understood that the observation was not really aimed at her. "Tell me about the social worker." "Mrs. Albright. She runs a Muggle literacy program." She's experienced, she's credible, her notes are meticulous. She won't be managed away from this. She's the kind of person who does a thing because it needs doing and doesn't stop doing it until it's done properly. Amelia made a note. And the priority classification, that standard procedure, given the observation report? Standard procedure for the indicators, yes. The specific circumstances make it. Elaine paused, choosing her words. There's an intersection of concerns here. The welfare issue is clear on its face. The fact that Harry Potter is who he is, that's a separate layer, but it's not separable. It affects how the case has to be managed. In what way? Because whoever placed him there, Elaine said, keeping her voice entirely even, made a choice. And that choice needs to be examined in the same inquiry as the welfare issue. You can't look at the bruises without looking at the placement. Amelia set her quill down. She looked at Elaine Marsh with something that was not quite approval, it was more like recognition. No, she said. You can't. They spent 40 minutes going through the case file together, the observation report, Elaine's assessment, the notes from her conversation with Arabella Figg, recorded carefully in language that read as a routine informant contact, nothing more. Amelia asked precise questions. Elaine gave precise answers. Neither of them was performing for the other. It had the quality of two people who are both good at something working at it simultaneously, which produces a particular kind of efficiency. At the end of the 40 minutes, Amelia Bones sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, which in her office had a slight yellowish tint from years of lamp oil, and said, I'm going to need to bring in the headmaster. I assumed. And I'm going to need you, Miss Marsh, to facilitate the Muggle side of this. The welfare check, the formal interview, the child's immediate circumstances. The Muggle system has jurisdiction over Harry Potter's physical welfare and I have no intention of removing that jurisdiction. It's kept him safer than we have. Elaine nodded. The inquiry on the wizarding side is going to look at the placement decision, the oversight arrangements, and, she paused, and something moved behind her eyes that might have been anger and might have been something more complicated, the degree to which people who had information about this child's circumstances chose not to act on it. There will be people, Elaine said carefully, with a great deal invested in a particular narrative about why the arrangement was necessary. Yes, said Amelia. There usually are. She picked up her quill. They'll have the opportunity to explain that narrative under questioning, which is where those kinds of narratives tend to simplify. She wrote something at the top of her notes, then slid the form across to Elaine with the quill. Elaine looked at it. It was a formal joint jurisdiction declaration, the standard ministry document for cases where Muggle and wizarding systems were operating on the same matter. Her signature went below Amelia Bones's. The document created a shared record and gave both of them standing to act. Elaine signed it. Amelia Bones took it back and dated it and filed it in the folder herself, which Elaine noted, she didn't give it to her assistant. She was keeping this in her own hands. Wednesday, Amelia said, for the welfare check. Tuesday, said Elaine. I already pushed it to Tuesday. Amelia Bones almost smiled. Good, she said. Tuesday. The news reached the Hogwarts staff room through McGonagall at noon. She hadn't intended it to be a staff meeting. She'd come to the staff room because Pomona Sprout was in there and Rolanda Hooch was in there and she'd looked at their faces, because she trusted both of them completely and she needed, briefly, to not be carrying this alone, and she'd sat down and said it plainly. Pomona had gone very still. Rolanda had said something short and sharp under her breath that a head teacher would have confiscated, and then both of them had looked at Minerva and waited. She's convening the inquiry, Minerva said. Amelia Bones. It will look at the placement and the oversight. Albus will be questioned. Will Harry be there? Pomona asked. At some point. Amelia will manage the sequencing. Minerva picked up her tea, which she hadn't drunk. The immediate priority is the welfare check. There's a Muggle social worker who's been first-rate about this, apparently. She'll handle the initial visit. By herself? Rolanda said. To that house? She won't be alone. Minerva set the tea down again. And whatever she finds, the child will not go back to that house afterward. Amelia has made that clear. Pomona looked at her hands. Then she looked up and said, where was he going to go? If someone had, he can go to the Weasleys, Minerva said. That's already being considered. Arthur Weasley has been contacted, and the family has space and the clearance and, she stopped. They care about him. Harry spent a week there before second year. She paused. He wrote to us about it. Do you remember? In the autumn. The first piece of creative writing I assigned that year, the one about a memorable summer experience. Pomona looked like she was deciding whether to cry. He wrote about that 1 week, Minerva said. A whole summer, and he wrote about 7 days. The staff room was quiet for a moment. Rolanda said, what do you need from us? Nothing yet. I'll keep you informed. Minerva stood up, because sitting still had stopped being possible. When Albus speaks to the staff about this, and he'll have to, I want people to be ready to ask the right questions rather than accept the first explanation. The greater good, Pomona said, and the 2 words had a particular dryness in her mouth. Something like that, Minerva said. Just, don't accept it quietly. She left the staff room and went back along the corridor toward her office, and the castle was cool and dim around her, the way it always was in summer with most of the students gone, and she walked briskly because briskly was how she dealt with the things that wanted to collapse her from the inside. She had known, on that night in 1981, that it was wrong. She had said so. She had said, these are not good people, Albus, I've been watching them all day. She had said it, and he had said the greater good and the blood magic and the protection, and she had accepted it, not because she believed him, but because she didn't know what else to do. Because she was not, in that moment, certain enough of herself to go up against Albus Dumbledore and a blood protection and the whole weight of a world that was desperate for Harry Potter to be kept safe, desperate enough to define safe as alive and not look too much further. She had gone home. She had gone to bed. She had gotten up the next morning. 9 years. She went into her office and closed the door and sat down at her desk and picked up a quill and didn't write anything for a long time. Then she wrote a letter. Not to Amelia Bones, who already had everything she needed from Minerva. Not to Dumbledore, who she'd already said what needed saying to. She wrote it to Harry Potter, care of Elaine Marsh, to be delivered after the welfare check, when he'd know that something was moving. She wrote it because she thought someone should have written it 10 years ago, and she couldn't fix that, but she could at least begin now. She wrote, Dear Harry. My name is Professor McGonagall. I taught you at Hogwarts, and I have thought about you every summer since I first met you, and I am ashamed that thinking was all I did. Things are changing now. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be brave about this, or patient about it, or fine about it. People are handling it, and they will not stop until it is handled properly. I wanted you to know that. Yours, Minerva McGonagall. She read it back. It was inadequate. Everything she might write would be inadequate. She sealed it anyway and wrote Elaine Marsh's name on the envelope and set it aside, and outside the castle windows the Scottish summer afternoon moved on, broad and oblivious, and somewhere in Surrey a boy was reading a book by torchlight and telling himself he'd figure it out. Harry spent Monday at home. Home being, in this context, the word that he'd always used for 4 Privet Drive in the same way you used a word because it was the only available one and not because it was right. He spent Mondays doing the garden if Uncle Vernon had left a list, which he had, and cleaning the kitchen, which was always expected whether or not it was on the list, and staying out of Dudley's way, which was the most continuous task and the one that required the most active management. He was good at all 3 of these things. He had been doing them since he was old enough to hold a trowel. He'd been thinking about Mrs. Albright since Thursday. Not in a worried way, exactly, but in a watchful way, the way he thought about anything he hadn't fully figured out yet. She hadn't rung the house, as far as he knew. She hadn't said anything to the other children. He'd gone over the conversation from Thursday a number of times and he couldn't find anything specific to be alarmed about. She'd just asked questions. Adults asked questions. The thing to do was to answer them correctly and carry on. Except she'd said, "I've never bruised my neck that way." Which was not the response of someone who'd been satisfied with the falling answer. He trimmed the hedge for 45 minutes, which was the precise amount of time it took to get the two sides even without getting them too short, which Uncle Vernon hated. He'd learned the exact tolerance about 3 trimmings ago. He swept the clippings into a bag and tied it and put it by the gate and went inside. The thing about Mrs. Albright was that she'd looked at him the way people almost never looked at him. Not like he was strange, not like he was a problem, not with the particular blank politeness of teachers at St. Gregory's who'd heard from the Desleys what to expect. She'd looked at him like he was legible. Like she was reading him and finding what she'd expected to find, and that was the part that made him uneasy, because he'd spent a long time being careful about what he showed and he didn't like the idea of someone reading through it. He made lunch, a sandwich for himself from the bread end and the cheese that was getting a bit old, because the fresh bread and the good cheese were for Dudley and Uncle Vernon, and sat at the kitchen table and ate it and thought. She was going to do something. He didn't know what, exactly, but the look on her face when she'd asked about his aunt and uncle, there had been a decision in it. He'd seen decisions in adults' faces before. They usually meant something was going to change, and in his experience, changes were not reliably improvements. He finished his sandwich and rinsed the plate and did the breakfast dishes that Dudley had left in the sink and put them away. He thought, "It's probably fine." Then he thought, she didn't look like a probably fine sort of person. He went upstairs and sat on his bed and opened his rucksack and took out Danny the Champion of the World, which was due back to the community center next session. He looked at the cover for a moment. In the story, Danny's dad never let Danny think he was doing it alone. Even when Danny was figuring things out by himself, there was someone at home who would want to hear about it. Harry thought about that for a while, and then he opened the book to the pheasant chapter and started reading, because thinking about it for longer than a moment was the kind of thing that led somewhere he wasn't ready to go. Downstairs, the doorbell rang. He heard Uncle Vernon answer it. He heard a voice he didn't recognize, a woman's voice, brisk and professional. He heard Uncle Vernon's social voice, the wide affable one he used for neighbors and people he was trying to impress, warm and caring and completely different from every other version of his voice. Harry put the book down. He couldn't hear what they were saying. He heard the door close after a short exchange, too short for it to be a real conversation. Then he heard his uncle's footsteps in the hall, heavy and deliberate, going toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, Aunt Petunia said something with a question mark at the end of it, and Uncle Vernon said something back that was too low to hear, and then there was a silence in the house of the specific quality that Harry had learned, over 10 years, to pay close attention to. It was the silence of something being decided. He sat very still on his bed and waited, and nothing happened, and after a while he picked the book back up and held it open on his lap without reading it, watching the door. Whatever was coming, it was coming. Somewhere in Little Whinging, Mrs. Albright's report was moving through a system she understood and a system she didn't, and Elaine Marsh had a meeting scheduled for Tuesday morning, and Amelia Bones had signed a document, and Minerva McGonagall was sitting at her desk in a castle holding a sealed letter. Harry Potter sat on his thin mattress with a book about a boy who figured things out, and the house was quiet, and the evening came on slow and warm, and he watched the door. Chapter 3. Nobody asked Harry. The social worker who came on Tuesday was named Carol Davies, and she was 42 years old and had done this job long enough to know that the houses she worried about most were never the ones that looked like they might be a problem. She'd reviewed Elaine's assessment on the drive over. She'd read Mrs. Albright's notes twice. She'd done 47 initial welfare checks in her career and she trusted her instincts, and her instincts right now, as she turned onto Privet Drive and clocked the identical gardens and the straight hedges and the car on the drive at number 4 that cost more than she made in 4 months, were telling her to go carefully. Elaine was in the passenger seat and had been quiet for most of the drive. Carol had worked with Elaine twice before and knew her as someone who was precise and contained and occasionally looked at things like she was seeing a layer underneath them. She'd assumed that was just Elaine's manner. She pulled up in front of number 4 and turned the engine off. "Ground rules," Carol said. "I lead. You observe. If I feel we need to speak privately, I'll ask you to take notes in another room." "Understood," Elaine said. "You've been here before?" "I drove past on Friday." "I haven't knocked." "Good." Carol looked at the house. Net curtains. A garden ornament. The specific cleanliness of somewhere that cared very much about what the outside looked like. "Ready?" They got out. Carol knocked. There was a pause, not long, but present, and then the door opened, and a large man filled the doorway with the particular quality of someone who had decided before answering that they were not going to enjoy this. Vernon Desley was broad and red-faced with a thick dark mustache and the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic once, a long time ago, and had since replaced that quality with volume. He was wearing his work clothes, which meant he was either about to leave or had just come back or wanted to appear to be a person with pressing professional obligations. "Mr. Desley," Carol said, and showed her ID card in the smooth practiced way that suggested she did it often. "I'm Carol Davies, Surrey Social Services. I believe you received notification of our visit." "I did," he said, in the voice of someone who had received the notification and considered various responses to it. He'd settled on a front, not the aggressive kind, but the aggrieved kind. The "I am a respectable man in a respectable house" kind. "I have to say, I find this quite extraordinary. We're a normal family, may we come in?" Carol said pleasantly. He stepped back. It was a small retreat, but it was one. The inside of the house was immaculate in a way that Carol clocked immediately and stored, the kind of immaculate that had been specifically created for today. Not lived in clean. Staged clean. There were surfaces that looked as though they'd been cleared of everything and then had a few careful objects placed back on them, like someone had Googled what does a normal living room look like and done their best. A woman stood up from the sofa. Petunia Desley was angular and blonde and held herself with the rigid posture of someone whose neck had been stiff for about a decade. She had pale eyes that moved quickly to Carol and then to Elaine and then back to Carol, and she had the look of someone who had been practicing a face and was not entirely sure they'd practiced the right one. "Mrs. Desley," Carol said. "Thank you for having us." "Of course," Petunia said. "Whatever we can do to help. This has all been a dreadful misunderstanding, we're just here for a chat," Carol said. "Is Harry home?" "A beat. He's upstairs," Petunia said. I'll get him." "Actually," Carol said, "I'll speak with Harry separately, if that's all right. It's standard procedure. One of my colleagues can stay in here with you while I speak to him." Vernon said, "I don't see why, it's standard procedure," Carol said again, in the exact same tone, which was pleasant and immovable. She looked at Elaine. Elaine took the cue and sat down in the chair near the fireplace, opened her notepad, and waited. Carol went upstairs. She knocked on the second door on the left, which was where Petunia had pointed. There was no sound from inside for a moment. Then a voice said, "Yeah? Harry? My name's Carol. I'm from Social Services. Can I come in?" Another pause. When she opened the door, she saw him. He was sitting on the bed with a book on his lap, and he'd clearly been sitting there for some time before she knocked. He was small for 10, she'd been briefed on his age and she'd still slightly underestimated it when she saw him. Dark hair, green eyes behind round glasses, a face that was watchful in the particular way she'd learned to recognize, not suspicious, not frightened, just, perpetually calibrating. The room was very small. She let herself take it in without obviously looking around, the way you learn to do. A bed, a small wardrobe, a desk with almost nothing on it. No posters. No football cards or plastic figures or any of the detritus that typically accumulated in a child's room like rings in a tree. One shelf with 4 books on it. She sat down in the desk chair, which put her at his level. He watched her do it. "You're not in trouble," she said, because she'd learned that was the first thing they needed to hear. "I know," he said, which was not the standard response. Most children said okay or good or looked relieved. He said "I know" with the authority of someone who had already worked out the landscape of the situation. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to ask you a few questions. There's no wrong answer. I'm just trying to understand what your life is like, day to day. Is that all right?" He looked at her. He was doing the thing Elaine had predicted, assessing how honest it was safe to be. Carol had seen it before, but not quite so clearly visible, not quite so active. "All right," he said. "Tell me about your day," she said. "Yesterday. What did you do?" He thought about it. Gardening in the morning. Trimmed the hedge. Swept the clippings. Did the washing up after lunch. Read for a bit. He glanced at the book on his lap. "That's mostly it. Do you do that most days? The gardening and washing up?" "Depends on the list." "The list?" "Uncle Vernon leaves a list. Jobs for the day. If there's no list, then it's the standard ones: kitchen, garden, anything Dudley leaves in his room." "Dudley is your cousin?" "Yeah." She wrote this down unhurriedly, as though it was ordinary. "And cooking? Do you help with cooking?" "I do most of it," he said. "Aunt Petunia does Sunday lunch." He said this without resentment, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with resentment. He said it the way you'd say it rains in November. Just the way things were. "What do you cook?" "Breakfast mostly. Bacon, eggs. Sometimes bigger things. I do Uncle Vernon's dinner if Aunt Petunia's got her book club." He paused. "I made a roast once. It turned out all right." He was 10. She kept her face exactly as it was. "Do you enjoy cooking?" He considered this with what she was realizing was his standard level of seriousness. He considered everything with this level of seriousness, as if the questions that most people would answer reflexively required actual thought. "Sort of," he said. "I like doing it right. When something comes out how it's supposed to." "I'm going to ask you something else," she said. "And I need you to tell me the truth, even if you're worried about what happens if you do. Can you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "I'll try." "Your arms," she said. "And your neck. I can see some bruising." She said it directly, because she'd found, with children who were this self-possessed, that approaching it sideways just made them more careful. "Can you tell me how that happened?" The silence was 4 seconds this time. She counted because Elaine counted and the habit had spread. "I fall a lot," he said. "Okay," she said. "Where do you fall?" He looked at her. "Because the bruise on your neck," she said, "is in a spot that would be difficult to get from falling." She said it gently. She wasn't accusing him of lying. She was giving him the information and seeing what he did with it. He looked at the window. There was a tree outside, and the leaves were moving slightly. He looked at the leaves for a moment. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "my uncle grabs me. When I've done something wrong." She wrote this down. "By the neck?" "By the arm mostly." The neck was, he was in a hurry. He said the last part in a tone that was entirely without drama, as if he was describing a slightly inconvenient weather event. She wanted to put down her pen and say something that wasn't professional, and she did not. "What had you done wrong? Before he grabbed you by the arm?" Harry's expression shifted slightly. Not a flinch. something more tired. Usually, he said, something that doesn't make sense to anyone else. Like what? He looked at his hands for a moment. I was talking to Mrs. Fig about her cats, and I came home late by about 20 minutes. And the other time, I got a better mark than Dudley on a test at school. He paused. Which I shouldn't have done. I knew I shouldn't have, and I did it anyway, which was stupid. She stopped writing. Getting a good mark on a test was the wrong thing to do. Dudley doesn't like it, he said simply. Carol Davies had been doing this job for 18 years. She was not, as a rule, surprised by things anymore. She had a very good poker face and a very good professional distance, and she maintained both of them continuously in the course of her work because that was how you kept doing it without it hollowing you out. Right now she was working hard. Harry, she said. Do you know why I'm here today? He looked at her. Someone saw the bruises. Yes. He nodded slowly. I thought it might be her. He said it without anything particular in his voice, no anger, no relief. Just recognition. Mrs. Albright. Is that okay? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, the way he did. Yeah, he said. I think so. You don't mind that she reported it? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she noticed. He said it like it was a complete sentence. Like it contained everything worth saying. She just noticed. That doesn't happen much. Carol made herself keep writing. How long has your uncle done that? She asked. Grabbed you when something went wrong? I don't really remember a time when he didn't, Harry said. Has he ever hurt you worse than bruising? A careful pause. Once, he said. When I was 7. He thought, something happened that he blamed on me. He lost his temper. He looked at the window again. It healed up. What healed up? My ribs. 2 of them. He said it with a complete absence of emphasis. It was the most terrible thing about it, the entire absence of emphasis. I didn't go to school for a week. Aunt Petunia told St. Gregory's I had flu. Carol put her pen down and looked at him. He looked back at her. He was not performing bravery or stoicism. He was simply telling her what had happened, in the tone of someone reporting facts, because the facts had long since stopped having a different quality from ordinary facts. This, she thought, was what years of being told you were fine did to a child. It removed the italics from the things that should have italics. It made everything the same weight. Harry, she said, you've been very honest with me. Thank you. He nodded. I need to tell you something. She kept her voice even. What you've described, the bruises, your ribs when you were 7, the things your uncle does when he's angry, none of that is normal. None of it is what should happen to a child. And none of it is because you got a test score wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him sitting with this, turning it over. Not rejecting it. Not collapsing into it. Just, receiving it, slowly, carefully. I know, he said finally. Not the I know of someone who had always known. The I know of someone who had always suspected but had never been told by an adult who meant it. She nodded. I'm going to help. Is that all right? He looked at her with those direct green eyes and said, You're not going to ring my uncle and tell him what I said? No, she said. I'm not going to do that. Something shifted in his posture, barely visible, but she caught it. About 2 degrees. Like someone had released a very small amount of tension from a wire that had been pulled for a long time. Okay, he said. Okay, yeah. She stood up and asked him if he'd be all right for a few minutes while she spoke to his aunt and uncle downstairs. He said yes and picked up his book and opened it, and she went to the door and paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. Harry. That book, is it yours? He looked up. It's from the library. The community center one. He paused. Mrs. Albright let me bring it home. Do you have your own books? He glanced at the shelf. Those 4, he said. I got them from a charity shop. They were 20 pence each. She nodded once and went out into the hallway and closed the door behind her, and she stood in the corridor of 4 Privet Drive for a moment with her hand still on the door handle. Then she straightened up and went downstairs. Elaine had been sitting with Vernon and Petunia Desley for 12 minutes. She had spoken 47 words in that time, all of them logistical. The Desleys had spoken considerably more. Vernon had explained, in the tone of a man presenting evidence of his own reasonableness, that they had taken Harry in when nobody else would, that they had given him a home and food and an education, that he was an unusual child with unusual tendencies, that the bruises were the result of clumsiness, which was frankly a bit of a problem they tried to address, and that the idea that their family required investigation was frankly offensive to a man who paid his taxes. Petunia had said less. She'd said, "We've done our best, it's been difficult, Harry is a very difficult child, we never expected," and then she'd stopped herself and looked at her hands and said, "We've done our best." Elaine had written it all down. When Carol came downstairs, Elaine read her expression from across the room in the way they'd learned to communicate on cases, a small movement of the eyes, a micro-tightening around the mouth that meant it's confirmed, and it's worse than the report said. Carol sat down. "Mr. and Mrs. Desley," she said, "I need to ask you a few questions about Harry's care." Vernon said, "This is completely, Mr. Desley." Carol's voice was pleasant. "I understand you find this stressful. I need you to bear with me." She opened her notepad. "Harry tells me he does most of the household cooking and a significant portion of the cleaning and gardening. Is that accurate?" Petunia said, "He's always been willing to help, he does those things," Vernon said, over her. "Yes. We believe in responsibility. Teaching a child responsibility, he's 10, Carol said. Not aggressively. Just precisely." "Well, he also told me," Carol said, and she watched both their faces, "that you've grabbed him on multiple occasions when he's done something you consider wrong. He told me about a specific incident when he was 7, involving his ribs." She kept her eyes on Vernon when she said it. Vernon went very red. It happened fast, his face went from pink to crimson in about 2 seconds, which told her the denial was coming from a bad place. "He's a liar," Vernon said. "He's a very unusual child," Petunia said quickly, and her voice had a slightly different quality to it now, not the rehearsed tone from earlier. Something more fractured underneath it. "He causes problems, things happen around him that," she stopped. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Carol said. Petunia looked at her hands. "It's been very difficult," she said again. "You have to understand. We never wanted," she stopped again. "You never wanted what, Mrs. Desley?" Petunia's mouth pressed thin. She didn't finish the sentence. Elaine was writing everything down. She'd been writing it all in her head long before the pen hit paper, the staging of the house, Vernon's immediate affront as armor, Petunia's fractured quality, the word unusual used repeatedly for a child. She was building the document that would go into the case file and eventually, in a different form, into the inquiry that Amelia Bones was preparing. "I want to be honest with you," Carol said. "About where we are. Harry has described a pattern of physical punishment that goes well beyond what is legally acceptable in this country. He's described it calmly and in detail and with specific examples, and his account is consistent with the observations that initiated this referral." She kept her voice entirely even. "That means I have an obligation to act. I can't leave this house today and close the file." Vernon said, "You have no right." "I have every right," Carol said. "I have a legal duty." "If you're suggesting that we've done anything improper," Vernon stood up, and he was a large man and he was very red and he was doing the thing that men in these situations sometimes did, which was to use his physical size in the room as an argument. We have given that boy everything. Sit down, Mr. Dursley, Carol said. He didn't. Sit down, she said again, same tone, same pleasantness, entirely immovable. Or I'll make a note that you refused, and that note will be in the file that goes to the inquiry. He sat down. Petunia was very still. She was looking at the carpet and her hands were in her lap, and Elaine, watching her carefully, thought, she's ashamed. Not performing shame, not afraid of consequences, actually ashamed. The shame of someone who has known for a long time that something was wrong and found ways not to look at it directly. That was its own kind of failure, Elaine thought. Different from Vernon's. Not better. What happens now, Carol said, is that Harry cannot stay in this house while an inquiry is ongoing. That's a standard safeguarding procedure. I have a family in mind who can take him. You're not taking him anywhere, Vernon said, in a voice that had gone very low. Mr. Dursley. She looked at him. Harry is 10 years old. He told me this morning that he got 2 cracked ribs at age 7. He told me it healed up. That is what he said, it healed up, in the tone of someone describing a mild inconvenience. She let that sit for a moment. I am taking him somewhere. The question is how cooperative you'd like this process to be. The room was very quiet. Petunia said, where will he go? A family, Carol said. They're known to him. He'll be safe. Petunia nodded. One small nod. She did not look at Vernon when she did it. Elaine went upstairs while Carol finished with the Dursleys. She knocked on Harry's door. Yeah. She opened it. He was still on the bed, still with the book, and he looked at her the way he looked at everyone, reading her, trying to figure out what the visit of a second adult to his door meant in practical terms. She sat in the desk chair. She looked at him for a moment, this child that both worlds had failed in their different ways, and she said, Harry, my name is Elaine Marsh. I work with Carol. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions of my own, if that's okay. All right, he said. Have you ever experienced anything unusual? Things that you couldn't explain? He went very still. She watched him recalibrate the entire conversation from the beginning. She could see him doing it, going back through everything, re-examining her through a completely different lens. His eyes moved slightly, just slightly, the way eyes did when a mind was moving fast. What do you mean by unusual? He said carefully. I mean, she said, things that happened when you were upset or frightened. Things that couldn't be explained by normal logic. He was very still for a long moment. Who are you? He said. Not afraid. Not accusatory. Just, the question of someone who had suddenly suspected there was a layer they hadn't accounted for. She said, I'm a social worker. That's completely true. I'm aware of a world that most people don't know about. And I know who you are. Not just your name. She kept her voice very steady. I know what happened when you were a baby, and I know that you've been in this house since then, and I know that for 10 years nobody from that world came and checked that you were properly looked after. He was looking at her with an expression that was impossible to read, which she suspected was by design. Are you angry about that? She said. A pause. I didn't know anyone was supposed to, he said. She held that. Well, she said, someone was. And they didn't. And a lot of people are going to have to answer for that. She kept her eyes on him. But right now, today, the only thing that matters is that you're leaving this house. You're going somewhere safe. Somewhere you know. Something moved through his face. The Weasleys, he said. She blinked. He'd put it together faster than she'd expected. Yes, she said. He looked at the window. He looked at his 4 books on the shelf. He looked at the book in his lap. Can I bring this back to Mrs. Albright myself? He said. The book. I don't want to just not return it. She looked at him. At the book. At the child who, in the middle of all of this, was worried about returning a library book. Yes, she said, quietly. We'll make sure of that. He nodded and put the book carefully in his rucksack. Then he went to the shelf and took the 4 books down and put them in the bag too. He opened the wardrobe and stood in front of it for a moment. She looked at what was in it and kept her face still, the 2 large clothes, the fraying edges, the single pair of shoes that were worn through at the heel. He packed methodically. He wasn't frantic about it. He wasn't tearful. He packed the way someone packed who'd learned to be efficient about what they needed, because what they needed had always been a limited list. When he had his bag, he stood up and looked around the room with a brief, comprehensive glance, the kind you gave a place you weren't coming back to. Ready? She said. Yeah, he said. She led him downstairs. Carol was in the hall. Vernon was in the sitting room, visible through the open door, standing with his back to them and looking out the window. Petunia was at the bottom of the stairs. Harry stopped on the second-to-last step. He and his aunt were almost at eye level. Petunia looked at him. Her face was doing something complicated, not affectionate, not apologetic, but not the blank controlled thing she'd been wearing all morning either. Something closer to the surface. Petunia, Elaine said gently, is there anything you'd like to say to Harry before he goes? The silence stretched. Harry looked at his aunt. He wasn't waiting for something. He wasn't hoping. He was just looking at her with those direct eyes, the same way he looked at everything, witnessing it accurately. Petunia said, "Be careful." It was not an apology. It was not love, or anything near it. But it was the only true thing she said out loud all morning, Elaine thought, the only thing that came from somewhere real rather than somewhere managed. Harry stepped down the last step and walked past her to the front door. He didn't look back. Outside on Privet Drive, the morning was bright and mild. Harry stood on the pavement next to Elaine's car and breathed the outside air for a moment. Carol came out behind them. She had a form in her hand, which meant the Dursleys had signed something, which meant they'd made the calculation that cooperation was the more survivable option. Harry looked up and down the street. The identical houses. The neat gardens. Someone down the road was putting out bins. It looked exactly the same as every other morning, which was a strange thing about the world, he thought, that it just carried on looking the same regardless of what was happening inside things. You all right? Carol said. Yeah, he said. We're going to make a stop at the community center on the way, Elaine said, to return the book. He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, and for the first time all morning something in his face shifted from careful and calibrated to just, surprised. Genuine surprise, uncalculated, the look of someone who wasn't expecting someone to remember a small thing. He got in the car. Elaine Marsh got in the driver's seat and Carol Davies took the passenger side and Harry sat in the back with his rucksack on his lap, and Elaine pulled away from the curb, and 4 Privet Drive got smaller in the rear-view mirror, and Harry looked at it once and then looked forward. The community center was 6 minutes away. Mrs. Albright was there, she'd been there since 9, running the Tuesday morning session, and when she looked up from her desk and saw who had come through the door, she took off her reading glasses and stood up slowly and put the glasses on the desk. Harry held out the book. I wanted to bring it back myself, he said. She took the book. She held it for a moment, and then she put it down on the desk and looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had since the first day, the same seeing look. How are you? She said. He thought about it. The thinking about it that was him, specifically, the real considering rather than the reflexive answer. I'll work it out, he said. She smiled at that. It was a real smile, not the professional warmth she'd used in the session. Something genuine and slightly sad and also, at the edges, something like admiration. I know you will, she said. I never doubted it. He nodded. Elaine touched his shoulder gently and they went back out to the car, and Harry got in and put his rucksack on his lap again and looked out the window as little whinging moved past on both sides and got smaller and then was gone. He didn't know yet about the letters that were moving. He didn't know about Amelia Bones's file, or McGonagall's sealed envelope, or Arthur Weasley sitting at his desk with his hands over his face. He didn't know about the inquiry or the hearing that was being planned or the conversations that had been happening for days about his life, in offices and staff rooms and ministry corridors. Nobody had told him. Nobody had asked him either, except Carol Davies, in a small room with a desk and a chair and 4 books on a shelf, who had sat at his level and listened to him in the way that people who were good at things listened. He thought about what she'd said. None of that is what should happen to a child. He turned this over slowly, like something fragile. He'd known it, in the way that Elaine had said, suspected it, understood it in an abstract sense, the way you understood things you'd read in books happening to other people. But there was a difference, he was finding, between knowing a thing and having an adult sit in front of you and say it plainly. Between suspecting you deserved better and someone telling you with their whole face that you did. It was a small difference. It was also, he thought, enormous. The car left little whinging behind and joined the A3 heading south toward the village where the Weasleys lived, and the morning opened up around them, whiter sky, greener fields, the particular English countryside that looked like it had been painted by someone who really liked green, and Harry watched it go past, and thought about pheasants, and working things out, and the part at the end of the chapter he'd read 3 times that always felt true. Nobody tells him how. He just figures it. The difference, Harry thought, watching the fields, was that Danny's dad was waiting at home wanting to hear about it. Maybe, he thought. Maybe this time. He didn't finish the thought. He let it sit half-made, like something he wasn't ready to look at directly yet but wasn't willing to put away either. The car drove on. Behind them, on Privet Drive, Vernon Dursley stood at the sitting room window and watched the street and said nothing. Petunia sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk and looked at the spot on the counter where Harry usually stood when he made breakfast and felt something that she didn't have the vocabulary for, because she had spent 30 years making sure she didn't develop the vocabulary for it. The house was very clean, and very quiet, and entirely the wrong kind of both. Chapter 4, Molly Weasley Goes to War. The burrow was making its usual sounds when the car pulled up, something banging rhythmically on the upper floor that was probably Fred, a radio playing somewhere inside tuned to a station that didn't exist on any Muggle dial, chickens doing what chickens did in the yard, and from the garden a sound that might have been Percy practicing a speech or might have been a ghoul. Harry got out of the car and stood for a moment. He'd been here for 1 week the previous summer. 7 days. He'd written about it in an essay for McGonagall in September, which he'd thought was strange at the time, that the most memorable thing about his summer was 7 days that technically weren't supposed to have happened, because the Weasleys weren't supposed to have known about him being stuck at Privet Drive, and Fred and George had flown a car to his window in the middle of the night, which was definitely not something you were supposed to do. He'd written about it anyway. He'd got an O. The front door opened before he reached it. Molly Weasley stood in the doorway with a tea towel over one shoulder and an expression that was trying very hard to be normal and not quite managing it. She was a broad, warm woman with red hair going slightly gray at the temples and eyes that missed nothing, and she looked at Harry with a thoroughness that made him want to check whether he'd left something behind. "Harry," she said, and the word came out with more weight than a name usually had. "Hi, Mrs. Weasley," he said. She stepped forward and pulled him into a hug that was firm and unconditional and lasted long enough that he didn't quite know what to do with his hands. He was not, in the general way of things, a person who got hugged much. He stood in it slightly awkwardly for a moment and then, because it showed no signs of ending, he put his arms up and hugged her back. She made a sound against the top of his head that might have been the beginning of something she'd decided not to say out loud. Behind Harry, Elaine Marsh was getting out of the car. Molly released Harry and straightened up, and her expression rearranged itself into the one she used for practical matters, which was focused and capable and suggested that things would be handled. "Come in," Molly said, stepping back. "Both of you. I've got tea." The kitchen was warm and slightly chaotic in the way the Burrows' kitchen always was, pots that stirred themselves, a clock on the wall with 9 hands all pointing to various states of home and work and traveling, a cat asleep on top of a stack of books. Ron was at the table eating a biscuit and looked up when Harry came in with an expression of genuine relief. "All right?" Ron said. "All right," Harry said, and sat down across from him, and Ron slid the biscuit plate across without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. Ginny appeared in the doorway for approximately 4 seconds, looked at Harry, went red, and disappeared back upstairs. Fred came halfway down the stairs, leaned round the banister, pointed at Harry with a look of theatrical outrage, and said, "He didn't even invite us this time." "You invited yourself last time," Harry said. "I prefer to think of it as proactive hospitality." Fred came the rest of the way down, ruffled Harry's hair in a way that would have been annoying except it wasn't, and stole 2 biscuits in transit to the sitting room. George appeared from wherever George always appeared from and leaned against the counter and said nothing, just looked at Harry with a steady look that was more serious than his usual one. George had a way of seeing things without making a production of seeing them. "Good to have you," George said simply. Harry ate a biscuit and felt something he didn't quite have a word for, something warm and slightly overwhelming, like walking into a room that was much brighter than the one you'd just left. In the sitting room, Molly was talking to Elaine Marsh. The door was mostly closed and Harry wasn't straining to hear them, but occasionally a phrase cut through: ongoing inquiry, formal placement, she'll be in contact regarding next steps. Molly's responses were clipped and careful in the way she got when she was exercising great restraint. Ron watched Harry eat a second biscuit. "Mum's been cleaning since 7 this morning," Ron said. "She cleaned the landing," George said, from the counter. "The landing doesn't need cleaning. It hasn't needed cleaning since 1987. She cleaned it twice," Ron said. Harry looked at the closed sitting room door. "Is she all right?" Ron and George exchanged a glance that contained a full conversation. "She will be," George said. Elaine left 40 minutes later, with a promise to call Molly on Tuesday evening and a formal case folder that contained emergency contact numbers, the inquiry timeline, and a letter from Carol Davies confirming the temporary placement. She shook Molly's hand at the door, and Molly held the handshake for a moment and said, "Thank you. For noticing. For doing something about it." Elaine said, "A Muggle Headteacher noticed first. I just followed through." Molly nodded. She stood in the doorway until Elaine's car had turned out of the lane and disappeared behind the hedge, and then she closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment. Harry was in the kitchen. She could hear Ron and George talking over each other about something, and Harry's voice occasionally between them, quieter than the others but there, actually present in her house, and she kept herself together because she needed to keep herself together right now. There were practical things to do. There was the room to sort out and Arthur was coming home at 6 and, Arthur. She pushed off the door and went to find the kitchen clock. She needed something to do with her hands. Arthur came home at 6:12. He came in the way he always did, a slight fumble with the door, something in his coat pocket clinking, the smell of the ministry about him that always made Molly think of ink and fire. He said hello to the kitchen in general, kissed Molly on the cheek, ruffled Ron's hair, nodded at Fred and George who were both pretending to be doing something useful, and then he saw Harry sitting at the table and stopped. "Harry," he said. His voice did something. "You're here." "Hi, Mr. Weasley," Harry said. Arthur looked at him for a moment with an expression Harry couldn't quite read, something glad and something else tangled up with it. "Good," Arthur said. "That's good. Are you settled in?" "He's in the room with Ron," Molly said, from the counter. Her voice was entirely even. "Good," Arthur said again. He put his coat on the hook in his briefcase by the door and sat down at the table, and Molly put a plate in front of him, and the family did what families did and ate dinner, and Harry ate more than he usually allowed himself and nobody commented on it because nobody made it a thing, which was its own kind of relief. After dinner, Ginny cleared the plates with the slightly terrified efficiency of someone who very much wanted to be useful and was trying not to look at Harry while doing it. Fred and George disappeared upstairs. Percy came down from wherever he'd been, acknowledged Harry with a formal nod that was Percy's version of warmth, and retreated to the sitting room with a book. Ron looked at Harry. "Chess." "Yeah," Harry said. They went upstairs. Molly waited until she could hear the chess pieces arguing with each other from 2 floors up. Then she poured Arthur's tea, and her own, and sat down across from her husband at the kitchen table, and said, "Tell me." Arthur looked at her. "Molly, you knew something," she said. Not loudly. That wasn't how she started these things. "You've known something for a while. I could see it on your face when you came in and saw him, and I've seen it on your face at King's Cross every year for 2 years, and I want you to tell me what it was." Arthur looked at his tea. He looked like a man who had been preparing for something and had found that preparation was not the same as readiness. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't know for certain." "What did you suspect?" "That it wasn't good. That they weren't treating him well." He looked up at her. "He always looked a bit thin," Molly said. "Yes. And the clothes. And the way he talked about them, when he talked about them at all. The way he didn't talk about them." He put both hands around his mug. "I told myself it wasn't my place. That Dumbledore would know. That if it were serious, someone would have, Arthur." He stopped. "He had cracked ribs at age 7, she said. He told the social worker this morning." "Cracked ribs," he said. Her voice did something, but she controlled it. He said it healed up. That is what a child says when they've been so thoroughly taught not to make a fuss that broken bones don't register as worth mentioning. Arthur closed his eyes. "And you suspected," Molly said, "and you didn't do anything." "Molly, I'm not finished." She kept her voice low and even, which he knew was not calm. It was the structural steel underneath the calm, the thing that held the rest up. "We have had that boy in this house. We have had him at our table. Ron talks about him every term, every holiday, he is Ron's best friend and he is a child who has been in a house where someone put their hands on him and I did not know and you had a feeling and you told yourself it wasn't your business." "Yes," Arthur said. "That's what I did." The kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked. The hand labeled Arthur had moved to home. "I am very angry with you," she said. "I know. I am angrier with Dumbledore," she said, "but I am also very angry with you." "I know that too. Because a feeling," she said, "is enough. That's enough to make a call or write a letter or knock on Dumbledore's door and say something isn't right. A feeling is enough for that. You didn't need certainty." "No," he said. "I didn't." She stood up and took her tea to the window and looked out at the garden, which was doing what the garden always did in the July evening, going slightly mad in all directions and being beautiful about it. She stood with her back to him and he waited, because he knew her well enough to know when she was organizing herself. "He came in today," she said, "with a rucksack that had 4 books in it. 4 books and 2 changes of clothes and a pair of shoes with the sole coming away from the toe, and I don't," she stopped. "I don't know how to be angry about the right things in the right order, Arthur. I want to shout, and I want to go and stand outside that man's house and say things to him that I didn't know I knew, and I want to, I know," he said quietly. "But Harry is upstairs playing chess with Ron and he doesn't need me doing any of that, so I'm standing here." She turned around. Her eyes were bright. Not crying, Molly Weasley cried, but not right now, because right now she was something other than sad. "Tell me about Dumbledore. Tell me what Amelia Bones has said to you." He told her. All of it, the memo, the blood magic justification, the placement decision, the inquiry. He told her about McGonagall's Monday visit to Dumbledore, relayed to him by a colleague who'd heard from someone in the headmaster's office. He told her about Elaine Marsh and the social worker and what Harry had said in that small room. Molly listened to all of it. When he was done she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's coming to see Harry." "Who is?" "Dumbledore." "I know it. He'll want to explain, to manage the thing, to make sure Harry understands the reasons." Her voice had an edge to it now that went past anger into something colder. "And when he does, Arthur, I want to be in the room." "Molly, I want to be in the room," she said again, very clearly. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a mild man, fundamentally, affable and curious and inclined toward generosity. But he had been married to this woman for 22 years, and he understood that certain things were not requests. "I'll make sure of it," he said. Upstairs, the chess pieces were being particularly aggressive. Harry had lost twice, which was normal, and was currently making his third attempt while Ron provided running commentary on his own piece's decisions in the way he did when he was thinking about something else. "Your bishop is about to do something you won't like," Ron said. "I can see that," Harry said. "Just saying. Still can't stop it." Ron moved his bishop. Harry's knight did an objecting sort of dance and tipped over. "Knew it," Ron said, without triumph. He looked at Harry across the board. "Are you all right, though?" "Actually." Harry looked at the chess board. He thought about actually. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "My mum's upset," Ron said. "Not at you. She's upset at the situation." He said situation with the slight self-consciousness of someone using an adult word. "She cried a bit before you got here. Dad didn't know I saw." Harry wasn't sure what to do with that. People crying because of his situation was something he hadn't encountered before. He wasn't sure if it was good or awful or both. "She doesn't need to," he said. "Yeah, she knows that," Ron said. "She just does it anyway. She can't help it. When Bill went to Egypt she cried for a week." He paused. "Different kind of crying, obviously." "Obviously," Harry said. They played chess in a comfortable silence for a while, and the burrow made its usual sounds around them, the ghoul in the attic, the clock ticking somewhere, something Fred was doing that they decided not to investigate. Harry moved a pawn in a direction that Ron immediately identified as suicidal. "She wrote to him," Ron said. "Before you got here. Mum wrote to Dumbledore." Harry looked up. "What did she say?" "Don't know. She sealed it herself." Ron captured Harry's pawn without comment. "But she used the red ink." Harry didn't know what that meant in Weasley household terms, but from Ron's tone it was significant. "Is that bad?" "She uses red ink," Ron said carefully, "when she's writing to someone she's being very polite to because she doesn't trust herself to be anything else." Harry thought about this. "Right. Yeah." Ron studied the board. "Checkmate in 3, by the way." "I see it," Harry said, and knocked his king over, and Ron did not gloat because Ron was occasionally an excellent person. Minerva McGonagall arrived the next morning at 9 o'clock without warning, which was how she operated when she needed to see something unmediated. She knocked at the front door. Molly answered it. They stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at each other, and something passed between them that was not words, the shared knowledge of two women who had both loved a child from a distance and found that the distance was the problem. "Come in," Molly said. McGonagall came in and accepted tea and sat at the kitchen table, and Molly sat across from her, and the two of them spent 15 minutes talking about the inquiry, McGonagall's meeting with Dumbledore, Amelia Bones's timeline, the formal questioning that was being arranged. McGonagall was precise. Molly listened and occasionally asked questions that were also precise, and McGonagall noted, not for the first time, that Molly Weasley was a great deal sharper than people gave her credit for. "Is Harry awake?" McGonagall said. "He's in the garden with Ron," Molly said. "They've been out since 8. McGonagall stood and carried her teacup to the window. She could see them, Harry and Ron at the end of the Weasley garden, doing something with a gnome that the gnome appeared to object to strenuously. Harry was laughing. She stood very still for a moment, looking at it. She had not seen Harry Potter laugh before. She had seen him focused, and determined, and occasionally rueful, and once or twice carefully pleased. But she had not seen him laugh, actually laugh, unprepared and genuine, the way a 10-year-old should look when a gnome bit his finger and he found it funnier than it hurt. She stood and watched and said nothing, and Molly came to stand beside her, and they both looked, and Molly made a sound that was soft and controlled. "Right," McGonagall said eventually. "I'd like to speak to him." She went out through the back door, and Molly stayed in the kitchen because she understood that this was not for her. The garden was long and wild and warm. She walked down the uneven path between the flower beds, and when she was about halfway down Harry turned and saw her. He went still for a moment, the same calibration she'd seen every September when he arrived at Hogwarts, adjusting to a new context. Then he straightened up slightly. "Professor McGonagall," he said. "Potter," she said. She glanced at Ron. "Mr. Weasley, give us a few minutes." Ron looked at Harry, who nodded. Ron ambled back up toward the house with the easy compliance of someone who had been well briefed. McGonagall stood in the Weasley garden and looked at Harry Potter. He looked back at her. He had mud on one knee and a small red mark on the back of his hand where the gnome had apparently expressed its views, and his glasses were slightly crooked and he looked like a child. Simply that. The obviousness of it hit her with a force she hadn't anticipated. He was a child in a garden who should have had nothing on him except the ordinary accumulated weight of being 10. "I wrote you a letter," she said. "I gave it to Miss Marsh to deliver, but I'm here now so I'll say it instead." He waited. "I have known where you were living since 1981, she said. "I knew before you were placed there that the family was not ideal. I said so. I was overruled. And then, because I was overruled, I told myself it was out of my hands, and I went about my business, and I did not check on you, and I did not push the matter, and I did not do what I should have done, which was refuse to accept an answer I knew was wrong." She kept her eyes on him. "I am telling you this because you deserve to hear it from me directly, and because I am sorry." Harry looked at her. The calibration was happening, she could see it. Working out what was being asked of him, what the appropriate response was. She held up one hand. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I'm not telling you so that you'll absolve me. I'm telling you because it's true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you know? About he stopped. "About what it was like." "I suspected," she said. "I did not know the specific details. I knew you were not with people who loved you, and I chose to accept that arrangement anyway, and that was wrong." He looked at the garden, the rambling disorder of it, the cheerful overgrowth. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not anger. Not devastation. Something more adult than either. A kind of accounting, putting things in the right columns, working out what added up to what. "Mrs. Albright noticed in 2 days," he said. "Yes," she said. "She did. And she did something about it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He wasn't saying it as an accusation, exactly. He was saying it the way he figured things out loud, piece by piece. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "I believe you," he said. "That you're sorry." He picked a bit of garden mud off his knee. "I don't really know what to do with it yet. But I believe you." She looked at him for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "What happens at the inquiry?" he said. "You'll be asked to give an account of your life at Privet Drive. Miss Marsh and Madam Bones will be there. Your testimony will be important." He nodded. No hesitation. "All right. You're not worried about it?" He looked at her with slight puzzlement, as though the question hadn't quite connected. What would I be worried about? She considered this. Some people find it difficult, she said, to speak about their experiences to an authority. To revisit things. He looked at the garden again. I told the social worker, he said. Carol. I just told her. It wasn't, he paused. It was easy, actually. I thought it would be harder. But she just asked and I just said and it felt, he searched for it. It felt like when something that's been balanced wrong gets set right. Does that make sense? She thought about a boy who had learned to hold everything compressed and still and at minimum mass, and the weight of carrying that for 10 years, and how it might feel to just once say the true thing to someone who was listening. Yes, she said. It makes complete sense. He nodded once. I'll talk at the inquiry, he said. It's not a problem. She looked at him, this child who at 10 years old was ready to walk into a room full of adults and say what had happened to him, without anger as a prop or performance as a shield, just with that flat clear honesty of someone who had figured out the landscape already. She felt the pride and the guilt in approximately equal measure, and neither of them belonged out loud right now. Good, she said. We'll prepare you properly. I'll come by before Thursday to go through it with you. He nodded. Then he said, Professor. Yes? The other thing you were going to say in the letter. The thing you said you'd say instead. He looked at her. Was it just the apology? She paused. No, she said. The letter also said, she straightened slightly. It said that I watched you on that doorstep in 1981, and you were beautiful, and I thought about that for 9 years, and I should have let it matter sooner. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, slow and careful, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She gave him a small nod and turned and walked back up the garden path. Dumbledore arrived that afternoon at 3:30. He did not use the door. He appeared in the Weasley kitchen with the small pop of side-along apparition, which was technically not announcing yourself, and Molly turned from the counter where she was making scones and looked at him with the calm of someone who had been expecting this and had prepared. Albus, she said. Molly, Dumbledore said. He looked around the kitchen. McGonagall, who was still there and had positioned herself at the table in a way that was not accidental. Arthur, who had come home early and was also at the table. Molly, at the counter, still holding a wooden spoon. Sit down, Molly said. He sat. She put tea in front of him. She sat down herself. The kitchen was quiet in a specific way, the way it got when the house understood something important was happening. I'd like to see Harry, Dumbledore said. In a moment, Molly said. First you'll sit here and tell me, not Minerva, not Arthur, me, tell me why you left him there. I want to hear you say it. Dumbledore looked at her. He was a man who had faced dark wizards and impossible choices and decades of wait, and right now he was being looked at by Molly Weasley in her own kitchen over a cup of tea, and she was, Harry could have told him if he'd been in the room, the most unnerving thing he'd encountered all year. The blood protection, he said. Lily's sacrifice created a charm that, I understand the magic, she said. Tell me why that was worth it. It may be that Voldemort, tell me why cracked ribs at 7 years old, she said, were worth it. Silence. Tell me why being grabbed by the neck was worth it. Tell me why clothes that don't fit and not enough food and 4 books and no one who loves him, tell me what the calculation was, Albus, where the result of that equation was acceptable. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. McGonagall was watching him. Arthur was watching him. There is no calculation that produces that result, he said. His voice was quieter than his usual register. Stripped of its usual warmth and architecture. I convinced myself there was. I was wrong. Yes, Molly said. You were. Molly, I'm not finished. She put her hands on the table. You are going to the inquiry. You are going to tell Amelia Bones everything, without management, without the greater good dressed up as explanation. And then, when this is over, Harry is going to stay here. Not as a temporary measure. As a permanent one. And I am going to write to Amelia Bones about guardianship, and you are going to support that application. Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at Arthur, who was watching him steadily. There are, Dumbledore said carefully, considerations regarding Harry's safety that, then you will address those considerations, McGonagall said, from the other end of the table, in a way that does not involve leaving a child with people who hurt him. He looked at her. The silence in the kitchen stretched. Yes, he said finally. Yes. I'll support it. Molly nodded. She stood up and went to the stairs and called Harry's name. His footsteps crossed the floor above, unhurried, not running, and came down the stairs. He came into the kitchen and saw Dumbledore and stopped. His expression did several things in quick succession and arrived at something that was straightforward and alert, without any of the reverence or awkwardness some students showed in Dumbledore's presence. Sir, he said. Harry, Dumbledore said. Sit down, if you will. Harry sat at the table, in the chair next to Molly. Dumbledore looked at him across the table and there was something in the old man's face that was not the arranged expression, not the warmth as policy. Something that had been worked through to arrive somewhere honest and uncomfortable and true. I owe you an explanation, Dumbledore said. I know about the blood magic, Harry said. Professor McGonagall told me. What do you think of it? Dumbledore said. And it was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not managing. He actually wanted to know. Harry looked at him steadily. I think, he said, that it might have made sense as a reason. I don't think it makes sense as an excuse. Dumbledore sat with that. There's a difference, Harry said, because he'd clearly thought about it already, and when Harry thought about something he had it in its full form. A reason is why you did something. An excuse is why it was okay. You had a reason. The other part you just decided was true. The kitchen was silent. McGonagall looked at the table. Arthur looked at Harry. Molly Weasley put her hand over Harry's and kept it there, and Harry looked at her hand for a moment and then left it where it was. You're right, Dumbledore said. I did. And I was wrong. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He had the eyes of someone who was deciding how much weight to give this, not mistrustfully, just honestly. Putting it in the right column. Okay, he said. Then, are you going to the inquiry? Yes. And you'll tell them everything? Yes. Harry nodded. He looked at the table, and then back up at Dumbledore. Is there anything you need me to do? Before Thursday? Dumbledore blinked. And it was small, barely a blink, barely a pause, but Harry caught it and Molly caught it and McGonagall caught it, the slight surprise of a man who had come here prepared to explain himself and had found instead a 10-year-old who had already moved past the explanation to what needed doing. No, Dumbledore said. Just, be here. That's enough. All right, Harry said. He reached across the table and picked up one of the uncooked scones from the tray Molly had left out, looked at it, and put it back. Molly batted his hand lightly without looking and he almost smiled, and the kitchen, the warm, slightly chaotic, entirely alive Weasley kitchen, held all of them for a moment in the ordinary difficult business of figuring out what came next. Outside, from somewhere up the garden, Fred shouted something at George. George replied with something that probably shouldn't have been shouted in a family garden. A chicken registered an opinion. The burrow made its usual sounds. Harry Potter sat at the kitchen table with Molly Weasley's hand over his and ate half a scone anyway, because he was 10 years old and he was hungry and someone had finally noticed that too. Chapter 5. The hearing. The room that Amelia Bones had requisitioned for the inquiry was on the 4th floor of the Ministry of Magic, in a wing that handled civil matters rather than criminal ones, which meant it didn't have the Wisengamot circular tiered seating or its atmosphere of accumulated judgment. It had a long rectangular table, 12 chairs, enchanted windows that showed a sky that was doing its best impression of cooperative, and walls that were the color of old parchment. It was not a courtroom. Amelia had been deliberate about that. She had also been deliberate about who sat where. She'd arrived an hour early and arranged the room herself, which her assistant had offered to do and she had declined, because the arrangement of a room told people things before anyone had said a word, and she wanted to be the one deciding what it said. The long table ran horizontally. At the far end, alone, was a single chair with a small conjured nameplate in front of it, Witness. At the near end, 2 chairs for Amelia and her co-examiner, a senior witch from the Department of Family and Child Magical Welfare named Theodora Vance, who had the reputation of someone who asked the questions others considered impolite and considered this a professional strength. Along one side of the table, seats for Dumbledore, McGonagall, and a ministry legal advisor named Croker who was there to ensure proceedings stayed within the bounds of what could be formally recorded. Along the other side, seats for Arthur Weasley, Elaine Marsh, and Carol Davies, whose presence Amelia had specifically requested because she wanted Muggle testimony in the room and had said so in the formal notice. Carol Davies had not been to the Ministry of Magic before. She had taken the news of its existence with the composure of someone who had decided, at some point in her career, that she would not be surprised by anything, and had found this policy occasionally tested but never broken. She had arrived with Elaine at 8:30 and walked through the visitor entrance with a visitor badge that said Carol Davies, Muggle Liaison, and had looked around the atrium with the expression of someone completing a thorough professional assessment and filing it away. She and Elaine sat together on one side of the table. Elaine was in her grey work suit. Carol had her case folder and her pen and the look she wore when she was about to be extremely thorough. Dumbledore arrived at 5 to 9. He was wearing robes that were more subdued than his usual, which McGonagall had not asked him to do and which she noted. He sat where his nameplate indicated without comment and folded his hands on the table. His half-moon glasses were on. His expression was the honest one, the stripped-back one she'd seen in his office on Monday morning. McGonagall sat beside him. She had a quill and parchment and no particular expression at all. The Dursleys arrived at 9 exactly, which meant whoever had collected them had been exact about the timing. They came in through a side door accompanied by a junior ministry official who had the slightly harassed look of someone who had spent 40 minutes managing Vernon Dursley's reaction to magical travel. Vernon was red-faced and rigidly upright and wearing his best suit, which was the suit he wore to the Grunnings Regional Sales Conference, and communicated, to anyone who understood such things, that he was treating this as a professional engagement and intended to perform accordingly. Petunia was in a pale blue blouse and her neck was stiff and her eyes moved around the room very quickly before settling on the middle distance. Vernon saw Dumbledore and stared. Then he saw McGonagall. Then he looked at the enchanted windows, which were showing sunshine, and looked away. They sat in the 2 chairs that had been placed to one side of the witness seat, not at the main table but flanking it, which Amelia had also deliberated over. Present, visible, but not at the same level. A small architectural statement. Harry was not yet in the room. Amelia had arranged it that way. At 9:05, she began. She didn't open with Harry. She opened with process. This inquiry is formally convened under Section 14 of the Wizarding Family Welfare Act, which provides for investigation into the welfare of magical minors placed under guardianship arrangements involving non-magical households. She said this without preamble, without softening. It is also conducted in joint coordination with the Surrey County Council Child Protection Team, whose assessment triggered this inquiry and whose documentation forms part of the evidentiary record. She looked around the table. The purpose of this inquiry is not punitive. It is investigative. We are here to establish the facts of Harry Potter's living conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, from 1981 to the present date, and to examine the decisions that placed him there and maintain that placement. She paused. We are also here to determine what happens next. Vernon Desley said, I'd like to state for the record, Mr. Desley, Amelia said, you'll speak when I ask you to. He stopped. Thank you, she said, and moved on without looking at him again. She called Elaine first. Elaine gave her account cleanly and precisely, the referral from Surrey Social Services, Mrs. Albright's report, the priority assessment, the visit, the joint jurisdiction declaration. She did not editorialize. She described what she had seen and what she had been told by Arabella Figg and what she had subsequently done. She presented her documentation and answered Theodora Vance's 3 follow-up questions in the same careful register. Then Carol Davies. Carol described the Tuesday welfare check at number 4. She described the house, the staging, Vernon Desley's opening response, Petunia Desley's fractures in the managed narrative. She described Harry's room. She described his 4 books and his 2 large clothes and his fraying rucksack. Then she described what Harry had told her, in the precise professional language of a welfare report, and the room listened in the silence of people who were being made to understand something they couldn't maintain distance from. He described, she said, a pattern of physical punishment involving his uncle that began at an age he couldn't specify but described as far back as he could remember. He described specific incidents. He described, and here she did not look at Vernon Desley because she was a professional, an incident at approximately age 7 in which he sustained 2 cracked ribs, which were not medically treated, and which he described in those terms. It healed up, with no emotional emphasis. Amelia said, what was your clinical assessment of that absence of emphasis? Carol looked at her. Normalization, she said. A child who describes physical injury in the same register as describing the weather has been taught, by prolonged exposure to that injury as a routine part of life, that it does not warrant a different register. It is one of the more significant indicators of chronic abuse rather than isolated incident. Petunia made a small sound. Everyone heard it. Nobody looked at her. Thank you, Miss Davies, Amelia said. She called Dumbledore next, which Harry, had he been in the room, would have recognized as deliberate sequencing. She was building a picture before its subject arrived. Dumbledore came to the witness chair without being asked twice, which McGonagall noted. Amelia said, in 1981, you made the decision to place Harry Potter, then 15 months old, in the care of his maternal aunt and uncle, Petunia and Vernon Desley, at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Is that correct? It is, Dumbledore said. You made this decision unilaterally? Without consultation with the Department of Family and Child Magical Welfare, without a formal welfare assessment of the proposed guardians, without any legal documentation under Wizarding family law? A pause. Yes. Why? He explained the blood magic. He explained it clearly and without embellishment, Lily Potter's sacrifice, the charm that resided in the shared blood between Harry and Petunia, the protection it offered against Voldemort and his followers. He explained why he had believed this protection to be necessary and why he had believed it to be the primary concern. Theodora Vance said, were you aware, at the time of placement, of any concerns regarding the Desleys' suitability as guardians? Another pause. Yes, he said. What were those concerns? Professor McGonagall had observed the family on the day of placement and expressed the view that they were unlikely to raise Harry well. Vance said, and you proceeded despite that concern? I did. Why? Because I believed the magical protection was more immediately critical. He paused. I believed that being alive was the prerequisite for everything else. That's a reasonable belief about priorities, Vance said pleasantly. What I'm asking is why you believed you could ensure one without also ensuring the other. He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said, slowly, that I didn't believe I could manage both simultaneously, and I made a choice about which mattered more, and I did not revisit that choice with sufficient rigor. You received reports from a Mrs. Arabella Figg, who lived near the subject and conducted periodic observation? I did. And those reports contained concerns about Harry's treatment? They contained observations. Mrs. Figg noted that Harry appeared less well cared for than his cousin. That he was often sent to her house rather than, she noted, Vance said, picking up the relevant document, and I'm quoting her most recent report, from 1990, Harry is frequently sent to me as an alternative to including him in family activities. His clothing is consistently inadequate. He appears smaller than typical for his age. He does not speak about his home life. She noted this, and filed it, in 1990. What action did you take? Silence. I noted it, Dumbledore said. The room was very quiet. You noted it, Vance said. Yes. She put the document down. She didn't say anything further. She didn't need to. Amelia said, Professor Dumbledore. I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. At any point between 1981 and this week, did you visit Harry Potter at 4 Privet Drive? I visited the street on the night of placement, he said. I have not returned since. You have not, in 10 years, visited the child whose safety you described as your primary concern. No, he said. I have not. Why not? The pause before his answer was long enough that people shifted in their seats. Not because he was evading, because he was arriving somewhere honest that required the full journey to reach. Because, he said, I think I knew what I would find. And if I found it, I would have to do something about it. And doing something about it meant disrupting the protection. And he stopped. I chose not to know. McGonagall looked at the table. Elaine Marsh wrote something in her notebook. Carol Davies looked at Dumbledore with the expression of someone who had heard a great many explanations for why adults had not acted on behalf of children, and was adding this one to a list that never got shorter. Thank you, Amelia said. You may return to your seat. She called Vernon Dursley. He came to the witness chair with his affront intact and his suit jacket buttoned and the expression of a man who had spent 40 years being the largest and most certain person in most rooms and found this a reliable strategy. Amelia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Dursley, I want to be clear about something before we begin. You are not currently facing criminal charges. This is a civil inquiry. However, the record of this inquiry will be available to the relevant Muggle authorities, including the Surrey Police, and if criminal charges are recommended by this inquiry or by the Muggle Social Services team, they will be pursued through the appropriate channels. Do you understand? Vernon said, I understand that I'm being subjected to a completely. Do you understand what I said, Mr. Dursley? A pause. Yes. Good. She opened the file. How would you describe your treatment of Harry Potter? He described it. He described it in the language of a man who had constructed his own story so carefully over so many years that he'd come to believe it completely, the difficult child, the ungrateful child, the strange things that happened around him, the need for discipline, the fact that they'd taken him in when they didn't have to, the fact that they'd fed him and housed him and sent him to school. He described it in complete sentences with the confidence of someone delivering a performance review. Amelia let him finish. Then she said, when Harry was 7 years old, he sustained 2 cracked ribs. Are you aware of that? Vernon went still. The injuries were not medically treated, she said. They were not reported to his school or to any medical professional. Were you responsible for those injuries? The silence was the kind that contained its own answer. Boys fall, Vernon said. He was always, Mr. Dursley. Her voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in the quality of it shifted. 2 cracked ribs. In a 7-year-old. Are you responsible for those injuries? He looked at the table. I lost my temper, he said finally. The words came out slightly crushed, like they'd been held in something heavy. It was one time. Was it one time? Amelia said. Or was it one time that produced injuries serious enough to be medically significant? He said nothing. Theodora Vance took over. She asked about the pattern of physical punishment, the grabbing, the specific incidents Harry had described to Carol Davies. She asked about the chores, the cooking, the cleaning, the garden. She asked about the clothing and the food and the room. She asked each question in the same pleasant precise manner, and Vernon answered some of them and didn't answer others, and each unanswered question sat in the record as its own kind of answer. Petunia was called. She came to the witness chair and she was very pale and she sat with her hands in her lap and she looked, for the first time in the proceedings, like someone who had stopped performing. Amelia said, "Mrs. Dursley, you are Lily Potter's sister." "Yes," Petunia said. "You were aware of the wizarding world before Harry came to live with you?" "Yes." "Did you know, when he was placed with you, who he was? What had happened?" "Yes," Petunia said. Something moved through her face. "Everyone knew." "You couldn't," she stopped. "It was everywhere. Even on our side. How did you feel about taking him in?" Petunia looked at the enchanted windows for a moment. The sky they were showing had gone slightly grayer, which might have been atmospheric or might have been the building responding. "I didn't want to," she said. "I want to be honest. I didn't want to. I had a son, I had my life, she stopped. I was frightened of what he was. Of what he might do. Of having the world I'd spent my whole life keeping out come into my house." She looked down at her hands. "So I suppose I didn't make him very welcome. And then Vernon, I let Vernon set the terms of things because it was easier than arguing, and I knew the terms weren't." She stopped again. "You knew the terms weren't fair to Harry," Amelia said. Petunia nodded. "Just the once. Small and definitive. But you allowed them to continue." "Yes," Petunia said. "It came out stripped. No performance around it, no justification. Just the word. Did you ever intervene when your husband was physically rough with Harry?" "Once," she said. I told Vernon to stop. He stopped." She looked at her hands. "I should have done it more." "Yes," Amelia said. "You should have." She let the silence settle. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dursley. You may sit." Harry came in at 11:15. He came in from the side door. Elaine had brought him up from the anteroom where he'd been waiting with a ministry aide who had apparently spent the waiting period learning about Quidditch. He looked around the room as he crossed to the witness chair with the quick comprehensive survey he gave all rooms, and when he sat down he straightened in the chair naturally, without stiffness. He looked at the people at the table. He looked at Dumbledore, and there was a pause that meant something, and Dumbledore gave him a small nod and he turned back to Amelia. He did not look at Vernon and Petunia. Not a pointed avoidance, they were simply not where his attention went. Amelia said, "Harry, my name is Amelia Bones. I'm the head of magical law enforcement. I want to thank you for coming in today." "That's all right," he said. "I'm going to ask you some questions about your life at Privet Drive. You can take as much time as you need with each answer. If you want to stop at any point, say so. Do you understand?" "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." She began. She started with the ordinary things, the daily routine, the chores, the meals. He answered each question with the same quality that Carol Davies had described, precisely, clearly, without the italics in places that should have had them. He described his day from getting up to going to bed with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of someone giving a timetable. He described the food, what he ate, what the Dursleys ate, the distinction between them. He described the room, the clothes, the absence of personal things. Theodora Vance said, "What did you do on your birthday?" Harry looked at her. He thought about it. "The same as other days," he said. "I don't think there's usually any. It's not something that happens, really." "Your birthday isn't celebrated?" "Not for me," he said. "Dudley's is. He gets a party." He said this without resentment, which was not better than if he'd said it with resentment, and everyone in the room understood that. When you say Dudley's birthday is celebrated, Vance said, and yours isn't, can you give us a sense of the difference? He thought about it. Last year Dudley had 23 presents, he said. I know because I counted them when I was taking them in from the car. Dudley counted them too and he was upset there weren't more. He paused. I got a coat hanger and a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. The room was very still. Were they presented to you? Vance said. As birthday gifts? Yes, Harry said. Aunt Petunia wrapped them. He said it entirely without drama. He was describing a fact. He had clearly described it to himself as a fact for years, and the fact had long since lost the capacity to sting, which was its own particular kind of evidence of what prolonged cruelty did to a child's interior landscape. McGonagall had her hands flat on the table and was looking at a fixed point on the wall. Amelia said, I want to ask you about the physical side of things, Harry. We've heard from Carol Davies about what you told her on Tuesday. I want to give you the opportunity to tell us yourself, in your own words. He nodded. He described it. He did it the same way he described everything else, with the clear-eyed accuracy of someone reporting observed data. He described the incidents he'd told Carol Davies about. He described the grip bruises. He described the ribs when he was 7 with the same slight emphasis, it healed up, that Carol had noted, delivered with the same complete absence of performance. He described the specific incident that had produced the bruising Mrs. Albright had seen. My uncle was in a hurry, he said. I'd got a better test result than Dudley and someone had apparently mentioned it to Uncle Vernon at work. He didn't shout or anything. He was just, quick about it, that day. Amelia said, when he grabbed you by the neck. Yes. She let a moment sit. Harry, she said, has anyone ever told you, before this week, that this was wrong? That it shouldn't happen? He thought about it with the seriousness he gave everything. Carol told me on Tuesday, he said. She was the first. No teacher, no family member, no adult in your life before Tuesday of this week. No, he said simply. Amelia made a note. Theodora Vance said, can I ask you something slightly different? All right, Harry said. When you come back to Hogwarts each September, you seem, from the accounts of your teachers, to be a capable, confident student. You have friends, you engage, you clearly enjoy being there. She looked at him. How did you manage that? Given everything. Harry looked at her. He was surprised by the question, she could see that. He turned it over. Hogwarts is different, he said. When I'm there he paused, searching for it. It's like the other thing isn't real. Privet Drive isn't real. It's a different world. He stopped. That's actually literally true, I suppose. A small ripple went through the room, not quite laughter, something adjacent to it. At Hogwarts, he said, people like me. Or, they don't not like me because of something I can't change. And I'm good at things there. Things that matter. He looked at the table. At Privet Drive I was good at things that were useful to other people. At Hogwarts I was good at things that were mine. He looked up. That's the difference. The room was quiet for a moment. Amelia said, is there anything else you'd like to say? Anything you think this inquiry should know? He thought about it. Mrs. Albright, he said. The head teacher who reported it. Nobody should, she just noticed me. She noticed in 2 sessions and she did something about it. He looked at Amelia. She's a Muggle teacher at a summer literacy program. She shouldn't be the person who fixed this. There should have been someone else, a long time ago. But since there wasn't, since she was the one who did it, I think that should be in the record. That she did it right. Amelia Bones looked at him for a long moment. It will be, she said. He nodded. He started to stand. "One more thing," Amelia said. "And this one isn't for the record, if you'd prefer. You can answer it or not, as you like." He settled back. "Are you angry?" she said. He looked at her steadily. He looked at the table. He looked at Dumbledore, briefly, and then back at her. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Whether I should be. I think," he stopped. "I think I'll probably figure out how to be angry about it properly later. Right now I'm mostly just," he looked for the word. "Busy. There are things happening and I'm following them and I don't really have space for the anger yet." He paused. "Is that strange?" "No," Amelia said. "It's very sensible." "It might come later," he said, like he was warning her. "We'll be ready," she said. He stood up properly this time and she didn't stop him, and he walked back across the room to the side door where Elaine was waiting, and he went through it without looking back, and the door closed, and the inquiry room held its silence for about 4 full seconds. Then Vernon Dursley said, "I'd like to." "No," said Amelia Bones. The formal recommendations came at 2 o'clock. Amelia Bones read them herself, standing at the head of the table with the parchment in her hands, in the room that now had slightly cold tea on the table and the specific atmosphere of somewhere that had been used for something important. The ministry would pursue a formal review of all magical guardianship placements in non-magical households, to be completed within 6 months. A permanent oversight position would be created within the Department of Family and Child Magical Welfare, specifically for cases like Harry's. Arabella Figg's observation reports had been entirely adequate and her concerns had been appropriately raised. The failure was institutional, in how those reports had been received. This was noted without ambiguity. Regarding the Dursleys, the inquiry's record would be formally shared with Surrey Police and with Surrey Social Services. The question of criminal charges was explicitly left open. Regarding Albus Dumbledore, the inquiry found that his original placement decision, while made with an arguable protective intent, was conducted without adequate safeguarding assessment and constituted a failure of his duty of care to Harry Potter. He was formally censured. A note was placed on his ministry record. He was required to cooperate with any subsequent family welfare proceedings relating to Harry. Regarding Harry's placement, effective immediately, his legal magical guardianship was transferred from the Dursleys to Molly and Arthur Weasley, with full ministry sanction, pending completion of formal Muggle legal proceedings which Elaine Marsh was empowered to facilitate. He would remain at the Burrow. He would not return to Privet Drive. McGonagall listened to this final item and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for so long she'd stopped noticing the tension of it. Arthur Weasley put his hands over his face for a moment. Not in distress. The other kind. Carol Davies made a note in her case folder and closed it with a small, clean click. Elaine Marsh sat very still and thought about a post-it note on the corner of her computer screen and the phone call she'd made on a Thursday evening and the fact that sometimes the protocols worked, if you pushed them in the right direction with enough force. Vernon Dursley was very red and very quiet. Petunia sat beside him and looked at her hands and said nothing, and the nothing was different from the nothing she'd been performing since she arrived. It was the nothing of someone who had run out of alternative versions. Dumbledore accepted his censure without comment. He had come to this room prepared to be honest and he had been honest, and the consequences of it were appropriate and he had no complaint to make about appropriate consequences. Amelia Bones set down the parchment and looked around the room. "This inquiry is closed," she said. In the anteroom, Harry was sitting on a bench with his rucksack at his feet, reading a book. The ministry aide who'd been explaining Quidditch was on a tea run. Elaine came through the door and he looked up. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He studied her face with the reading the room quality he had. "And? You're not going back," she said. He held that. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned everything over. "The Weasleys," he said. "Permanently. Legal guardianship. It'll need some Muggle paperwork completed, but that's just paperwork. It's decided. He looked at his book. He looked at the cover for a moment in the way he'd looked at the Privet Drive street that last time, not sentimental, not devastated, just accurately witnessing a thing that was ending. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She sat down next to him on the bench. How are you? He thought about it. The real thinking, not the reflexive kind. Hungry, he said. I didn't eat much of the thing they gave me at 11. She looked at him. Then she laughed, a real one, slightly startled out of her. We'll stop somewhere on the way back, she said. He nodded. He put the book in his bag and stood up and straightened his glasses, and Elaine Marsh, who had started this process on a Thursday afternoon with a form and a post-it note and a cold cup of tea, stood up beside him, and they walked out of the Ministry of Magic together, through the atrium with its golden statues, out into the phone box that was the visitor exit, and up into the London afternoon. The city moved around them with complete indifference, the way cities did, and Harry stood on the pavement for a moment and looked at it. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course, she said. The hearing today, the things that were decided. Dumbledore's censure, the review of placements, all of it. He looked at the street. Will it actually happen? Or will people say it happened and then sort of not get around to it? She looked at him. At the specific, measured skepticism of a 10-year-old who had learned, through a decade of being told things were fine, to read the gap between what people said and what they did. Amelia Bones will make it happen, she said. And I'll make sure the Muggle side stays on it. And your Professor McGonagall will not let anyone forget. She paused. It won't be perfect. But it'll be real. He thought about this. He nodded once, with the decisive quality he had, the putting it in the right column nod. All right, he said. That's enough. They walked to the car, and the London afternoon was warm and loud and entirely ordinary, and Harry Potter ate an entire meal deal from the pret-a-manger on the corner, sandwich, crisps, apple, and an orange juice, with the focused application of someone who was hungry and had decided that being hungry was no longer the kind of thing he was going to be quiet about. Chapter 6. What happens after the room they gave him was on the 3rd floor of the Burrow, up a staircase that went slightly sideways at the landing and had a step that creaked differently from all the others, a higher note, almost musical, which Harry found out about on his first night and remembered every night after that. It wasn't a large room. It had a sloped ceiling on one side, a window that looked out over the garden and caught the morning sun at an angle that made a stripe of gold across the floorboards by 7, and a bed with a patchwork quilt that Molly had made from pieces of old Weasley jumpers in 8 different colors. The walls had been repainted recently, he could tell by the slightly brighter patch near the door where a poster had probably been. Someone had put a bookshelf up, and it was empty, which felt like an invitation rather than an absence. He'd stood in the doorway on his first proper night and looked at it for a moment. Ron had appeared at his shoulder. It was Fred's before he moved in with George, Ron said. Mum repainted. She said it needed a fresh start. Harry had looked at the empty shelf. She said that was for your books, Ron said. When you get them. He'd put the 4 charity shop books on it that night, spread out so they didn't look too sparse, and stood back and looked at them. Then he'd moved them closer together in the middle, because they were his and they didn't have to pretend to be more than they were. He'd slept better than he had in years. The first week at the Burrow had the quality of something Harry didn't have an exact word for, not holiday, because holidays implied a return date. Not home, because he was careful with that word, had always been careful with it. Something between the two, something that was in the process of becoming a third thing he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. He woke at 6 the first few mornings from the habit of chores, the ingrained understanding that the day began with something required of him, and lay in the sloped ceiling room with the morning light making its stripe across the floor and waited for the list to appear in his head, and it didn't. There was no list. There was just the room and the light and, from somewhere below, the sound of the Burrow starting up, Molly in the kitchen, something clattering, the wireless playing. On the 3rd morning, he went downstairs. Molly was at the stove with her back to him, her wand moving a wooden spoon around a pot of porridge. She heard him on the stairs and said, without turning, "Morning. Sit down, it's almost done." He sat at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall had all 9 of its hands pointing to home. He looked at the hand labeled Harry, which had appeared sometime in the past 2 days, and felt something in the region of his sternum that he didn't examine too closely. Molly put porridge in front of him and sat down across from him with her own bowl, and they ate in the early morning quiet, and she didn't ask him how he'd slept or how he was feeling or whether anything was wrong, which he appreciated enormously. After a few minutes she said, "Arthur's taking the boys to the joke shop in Diagon Alley on Friday. If you want to go." "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." She nodded and ate her porridge, and the morning came on around them, and the clock ticked, and the wireless played something low and instrumental, and Harry had 2 bowls of porridge because she'd made extra and left the pot on the table where he could reach it, and didn't look at him when he served himself the second, which was the precise right way to handle it. Fred taught him to be loud at dinner. This was not a formal lesson. It happened organically, over the first several evenings, as Harry discovered that the Weasley dinner table operated on completely different social physics from anything he'd encountered. Everyone talked simultaneously. The talking overlapped and interrupted and doubled back on itself, and the rule was apparently that if you wanted to be heard you simply continued saying your thing until someone responded, and if no one responded yet you just kept saying it. Harry's instinct, the first 2 nights, was to wait for a gap. There were no gaps. He waited through an entire meal the first night and didn't say anything, which went entirely unnoticed because nobody was being deliberately exclusive, it was simply that the Weasley dinner table was a full-contact sport. On the 3rd night Fred pointed a fork at him across the table and said, "Potter." Argument. Harry said, "What?" "You've got an opinion about whether the Tornadoes can take the Magpies this season." "What is it?" "I haven't really thought, think faster," Fred said. "George just said something wrong and someone needs to tell him." "I said something correct," George said, "and Fred is being defensive because he bet 2 galleons on the Magpies." Harry said, "I think the Tornadoes have a better keeper." Fred pointed the fork at him approvingly. "See, that's a complete thought. Now say it like you mean it." "I think the Tornadoes have a better keeper," Harry said, louder. "There you go," Fred said. "Their seeker is faster too," Harry said, because he'd now started and it turned out it wasn't very hard once you started. "Magpies haven't got a reliable seeker since Urquhart retired." "Where did you get that?" George said. "Read it in Which Broomstick." "He reads Which Broomstick," Fred said to George, with the tone of someone announcing a discovery. "I've been reading it since first year," Harry said. "Mrs. Hooch leaves copies in the changing rooms." "Our seeker," Fred said, pointing the fork again, "reads Which Broomstick and has opinions about keeper statistics. We've been wasted at St. Mungo's." "What?" Harry said. "We should have been managers," George said gravely. "The talent we've overlooked." Harry ate his dinner and argued about Quidditch with Fred and George simultaneously, and Ron joined in on the Tornadoes' side, and Percy said something from behind his copy of Hogwarts, a history that was technically relevant to the keeper statistics debate and was told so by Harry, and Percy looked startled and slightly pleased, and the dinner carried on around the table in all its noise and heat and overlap. Later, washing up with Ron, Harry said, "Is dinner always like that?" "Pretty much," Ron said. "I like it," Harry said. Ron handed him a plate to dry. "Yeah," Ron said. "Me too." Ginny got over being terrified of him by the end of the first week, which happened in a way that neither of them planned. He was in the garden on Thursday afternoon, doing something with a garden gnome that had got its teeth into the hem of his jeans and declined to let go, and Ginny came out through the back door and saw the situation, and instead of going red and retreating, as she had every other time she'd encountered him, she came over and grabbed the gnome by the scruff of its neck and detached it from his jeans with a firm rotating motion. "You have to spin them," she said. "They don't let go otherwise." "I didn't know that," Harry said. Fred showed me last summer. She spun the gnome once, twice, 3 times, and released it in a high arc over the hedge. It made a sound like a small angry person, which it was. The trick is committing to the spin. Right, Harry said. She looked at him. He looked at her. She went slightly pink but didn't retreat. Thanks, he said. You're welcome, she said, with the deliberate composure of someone who had decided to be normal about something. They stood in the garden for a moment. There are loads more in the vegetable patch, she said. If you wanted something to do. Yeah, all right, he said. They spent the next hour removing gnomes from the vegetable patch, and Ginny explained the spin technique in more detail, and Harry got reasonably competent at it by the end, and they talked about other things, her first year coming up, the books she'd been reading, a bet she'd made with Fred that she was going to lose, and by the time they went back in for tea she had stopped treating him like a portrait on a wall and was treating him like a person, which was a better condition for everyone. McGonagall came by on Saturday. She arrived at mid-morning, fled into the sitting room, and found Harry at the kitchen table with Ron and a wizard chessboard, which she looked at with the expression of someone suspending their professional opinion about the game's suitability for children on the grounds that she had more important things to discuss. Mr. Weasley, she said, I'll need Harry for a little while. Ron went without complaint, pausing only to tell his knight to stop doing that. McGonagall sat at the table. Molly appeared in the kitchen doorway, and McGonagall looked at her, and something passed between them, and Molly went back to the sitting room and closed the door. Harry looked at his professor. How's the week been? She said. He thought about it. Good, he said. Genuinely. She nodded. The paperwork for the guardianship is moving. Elaine Marsh has been very efficient on the Muggle side. Arthur is completing the wizarding documentation with the ministry this week. It should be finalized in a fortnight. He nodded. I also, she said, wanted to speak with you before you come back to Hogwarts in September, about how things will be handled there. Your head of house is responsible for your welfare. That's me. It has always been me, technically, and I have not always treated it as seriously as I should have. She met his eyes. That changes. You can come to me. For anything. All right, he said. I mean anything, Potter. Anything that isn't right. Anything that worries you. Anything at all. He looked at her for a moment. Including Snape, he said. McGonagall's expression did something that was extremely controlled. Including Professor Snape, she said. Yes. He almost smiled. Noted, he said. She looked at him. Then she put something on the table, a small flat envelope, Hogwarts crest on the seal, Harry's name on the front in her own square handwriting. Not the arranged handwriting of official correspondence. Her actual handwriting, which was smaller and sharper than her formal script. I wrote the letter, she said. In the end. The one I mentioned in the garden. She pushed it across the table. You don't have to read it now. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. On the night I was left on the doorstep, he said. You said you watched. He looked at the envelope. What did you do after? When you went home. She was quiet for a moment. He waited. I made tea, she said. I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about going back. She looked at her hands. I didn't. I told myself I'd been overruled by someone who knew better than I did. She paused. In the morning I started preparing for the new term. He turned the envelope over again. I think, he said slowly, that you were scared of being wrong. Not about the Dursleys. About what it would mean if you pushed back and it turned out the greater good argument was right. If protecting me from Voldemort really did require all the rest of it. He looked up at her. Because then it would be your fault for interfering. She held very still. That's not an excuse, he said. I'm just saying what I think it was. How, she said, very quietly, are you this measured about it? He considered. I had a lot of time to think, he said. Not much else to do, some evenings. He set the envelope on the table. And I read a lot. Reading teaches you to follow something to where it ends up. She looked at him across the kitchen table for a long moment. You're going to be extraordinary, she said. And it wasn't the expansive praise of someone performing confidence in a student. It was the flat, certain observation of someone who had looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion. He looked slightly uncomfortable. I just want to get through second year without breaking anything major, he said. That is, she said, an extremely low bar. I like achievable targets, he said. She almost laughed. It came out as a controlled exhale with warmth in it, which for Minerva McGonagall was the equivalent of laughing freely. She stood and straightened her robes and said she'd see him at the start of term, and she went back to the sitting room and fled home, and Harry sat at the kitchen table and turned the envelope over once more and then put it in the pocket of his jeans, carefully, to read later in his room. Dumbledore came on the following Tuesday, which was 11 days after the hearing. He came the way he'd come before, flood into the sitting room, but this time he'd written ahead, which Molly had told Harry about that morning over breakfast with the particular tone she used for information delivered neutrally but received with strong feelings. Harry had said, okay, and eaten the rest of his eggs. He'd thought about it for the rest of the morning, not with dread exactly, but with the careful attention he gave things that needed figuring out before they arrived. He'd thought about the hearing room and Dumbledore's voice saying I chose not to know, which was the most honest thing the old man had said in the whole proceedings and which Harry had turned over many times. He'd thought, there's a difference between a person who did wrong and is sorry and a person who did wrong and wants to be forgiven. He hadn't yet decided which one Dumbledore was. He was going to see. Dumbledore arrived at 2. Molly made tea and then, to Harry's slight surprise, left the kitchen. Not obviously, she said she had things to do upstairs and she went, and Arthur, who had taken the afternoon from work, went with her, and the kitchen was Harry and Dumbledore and the tea. Harry poured. He'd learned that you poured for the guest first, from watching Molly, and he did it automatically now. Dumbledore wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked older here, Harry thought, than he looked at Hogwarts. Or the same age, maybe, but more visible about it. How are you finding it here? Dumbledore said. Good, Harry said. I like it here. The Weasleys are good people, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. A pause. Harry, Dumbledore said, I'd like to have an honest conversation, if that's all right. That's why I'm here, Harry said. Simply, without edge. Dumbledore looked at him. He looked at his tea. He set it down on the table. I want to explain myself to you, he said. Not justify, I don't think what I did can be justified. But I think you deserve to understand it, if you want to. Harry nodded. Go ahead. Dumbledore explained. He explained Voldemort, not the name in lowered tones, but the full thing, the history, the specific dimensions of the threat. He explained the prophecy, which was the part Harry hadn't known, and he said it straight, in the language of someone who had decided that information withheld from people it directly concerned was not protection but condescension. Harry listened to all of it. The prophecy. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. Neither can live while the other survives. He sat with all of it and followed it to where it ended up, the way reading had taught him to, and said nothing until Dumbledore had finished. Then he said, You've known this about me since before I could walk. Yes. And you thought, what? That knowing it would hurt me? I thought, Dumbledore said carefully, that a child should be allowed to be a child for as long as possible. Before the weight of it. Harry thought about this for a long time. The thing is, he said, I wasn't a child. At Privet Drive. I didn't get to be one. He looked at the table. So you protected me from the knowledge of a prophecy while I was cooking breakfast at 6 years old and getting cracked ribs at 7. The weight you were worried about was the wrong one. Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment. Yes, he said. You're right. I'm not saying it to hurt you, Harry said. I'm saying it because it's true. I know, Dumbledore said. I know you are. Harry looked at him steadily. You really believe you were doing the right thing? I believed it, Dumbledore said. I'm no longer certain I was thinking clearly enough to know. Because you were tired, Harry said. After the war. You were the one who had to put all the pieces back together and you were exhausted and you made a decision that was easier than the alternative. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that Harry had not seen on his face before, not the wise warmth, not the arranged comfort, but something rawer. The look of someone being understood by a person they'd underestimated. Partly, he said. Yes. Harry nodded. He picked up his tea. He drank some of it. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, he said. Because it isn't. And I'm not going to say I forgive you, because I'm not sure I've done whatever the work of that is yet. He set the mug down. But I don't think you're a bad person. I think you made bad decisions and told yourself they were good ones for long enough that you stopped being able to tell the difference. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. That's a more generous assessment than I deserve, he said. Maybe, Harry said. But it's accurate. Silence. The burrow made its sounds around them, something from upstairs, Percy's voice reading something aloud in what was probably revision, a chicken outside. There's something I want, Harry said. Name it. The oversight position that Amelia Bones is creating. For magical minors in Muggle households. He looked at Dumbledore. I want it to be real. I want you to make sure it's funded and staffed and that the people doing it are the kind of people who follow through. Not file a report and note it. He held Dumbledore's eyes. I wasn't the only one. There are others. I want the thing to actually work. Dumbledore looked at him, at the boy who had spent 10 years invisible, who had just sat in a ministry hearing room and asked for his name to be left out and Mrs. Albright's put in, who was now sitting across a kitchen table and asking for something not for himself but for children he'd never met. I'll make it my personal responsibility, Dumbledore said. I'll hold you to that, Harry said. I know you will, Dumbledore said. I'm counting on it. They sat together for a while longer, in the Weasley kitchen, drinking tea. They talked, not about anything momentous, just talked, the way people did when they were figuring out a new register with each other. Dumbledore asked about his reading, and Harry told him about the Danny the Champion of the World thing, the figuring it out passage, and Dumbledore listened without performing wisdom about it, just listened, which was the right thing to do. When he left, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked back at Harry. For what it's worth, he said, I thought about you. Every summer, without fail, I thought about you. Harry looked at him. I'm glad, he said. I hope it bothered you. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Every day, he said. He went through to the sitting room and the green fire took him, and Harry sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes and finished his tea. Then Molly came downstairs with the very deliberate air of someone who had definitely not been listening at the top of the stairs, and asked if he wanted biscuits. Yes please, he said. She put biscuits on the table and sat across from him and picked one up and said, he's a complicated man. Yeah, Harry said. But he means well. I know, Harry said. That's the most annoying thing about him. Molly laughed, a real one, sudden and warm, and Harry heard it land and felt the warmth of it reach him, and ate a biscuit. The letter from Mrs. Albright came on a Friday. It had been routed through Elaine Marsh, who'd enclosed her own brief note. She asked if you were all right. I said I thought you were. She asked if she could write. I said I'd ask you. You don't have to respond, but I thought you'd want to know. Harry read the letter in his room, on the bed with the patchwork quilt, with the late afternoon sun making its stripe across the floorboards. Mrs. Albright wrote the way she talked, directly, without fuss. She said she was glad he was all right. She said she'd been thinking about him. She said the summer program had 4 more weeks and there were 2 new students who were both good readers, which she thought he'd appreciate. She said that she'd heard, through Elaine, that the situation had been resolved, and she was very glad, and she hoped wherever he ended up was somewhere he could be properly loud at the dinner table. At the bottom, in the same brisk clear hand, she wrote, "You told me you'd work it out. I never doubted it. You're the Danny type, not the waiting type. Keep that." He read it twice. He went to his bookshelf, which had 6 books on it now, because Ron had given him 2 and Molly had added one she said was a spare and Hermione had sent one from her holiday with a note that said, "I thought you'd like this, the main character reminds me of you, though I suspect you'd deny it," and he got Danny the champion of the world and put it on the shelf in the center. He wrote back to Mrs. Albright that afternoon, sitting at the small desk in his room, in his own handwriting which was neater than people expected, "Dear Mrs. Albright, I am all right. I am somewhere with a garden and a family that argues about Quidditch and a staircase that makes a sound like music and people who leave the porridge pot on the table so you can have more. It turns out that's what it was supposed to be like. Thank you for noticing. Thank you for doing something about it. I know that's just your job, but I think your job is more important than most people know. Yours, Harry Potter. P.S. I still like the pheasant chapter best." He read it back. Then he added at the bottom, "P.P.S. I am actually quite loud at dinner now." He folded it and addressed it and went downstairs and asked Molly if she knew how to post a letter to a Muggle who didn't know about owls, and Molly said of course and found him a stamp from the drawer where miscellaneous things went, and he walked down the lane to the postbox at the corner and posted it in the ordinary way, in the ordinary world, like any child would. He had been at the Burrow for 3 weeks when the thing happened that he thought about for a long time afterward. He woke at 3 in the morning from a dream that dissolved the moment he opened his eyes, leaving only the residue of it, a room with a locked door, a list of chores on the counter, a feeling of diminishing. He lay in the dark for a moment. The Burrow made its night sounds around him, the ghoul shifting, the settle of old timber, something that might have been Percy's alarm clock going off 2 hours early. Because Percy. He lay there and the feeling from the dream faded, the way feelings did when you gave them room rather than holding them compressed. He thought, "I'm at the Burrow. The clock downstairs has a hand with my name on it." He thought, "Molly made extra porridge." He thought, "I have a shelf with books on it." He thought, "Ginny showed me how to spin a gnome and didn't make it into anything." He thought, "The stair has a sound like music." He thought about all of these things, one after the other, and the dream residue finished fading, and he lay in the dark in the room with the sloped ceiling and the patchwork quilt, and after a while he went back to sleep. In the morning the sun came through the window at 7 and put its stripe of gold across the floorboards, and Harry lay and watched it for a moment, just the light, just the ordinary early light, and then he got up. He went downstairs. The kitchen was already warm. Molly was at the stove. She said, without turning, "Sit down, it's almost done." He sat. The clock on the wall had all 9 hands at home. He read the hand with his name on it for a moment, this small declarative thing, Harry, home, and then looked away, out the window at the garden going through its morning in all its unruly magnificent disorder. Ron came down eventually and dropped into the chair across from him and yawned so widely that his jaw clicked, and reached for a piece of toast. "Chess later?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. Molly put porridge in front of them both. She didn't say anything particular about it. She went back to the stove and the wireless was playing, and outside a gnome said something from the vegetable patch that they all pretended not to hear. Harry ate his breakfast and the morning came on around him, warm and noisy and full of people who knew he was there and were glad about it, and it was not a dramatic thing, it was, in fact, quite ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was precisely the point. He had spent 10 years in a house where nobody wished he were there. He was done with that. He ate his porridge. He had seconds. He argued with Ron about chess strategy and Ron told him he was wrong and he told Ron he'd prove it later, and Molly made a sound of amusement at the stove without turning, and Fred came downstairs wearing one sock, and George appeared directly behind him wearing the other one, and Ginny called something from upstairs that nobody answered satisfactorily, and Percy's voice could be heard doing early morning revision, and Arthur came through the kitchen with his traveling cloak looking for his briefcase and found it and kissed Molly and said morning to the room and the room said morning back, all of it, all of them, ordinary and real and his. Harry Potter sat at the kitchen table in the burrow and went to sleep that night in a house where nobody wished he weren't there. And this time, it wasn't 7 days.